for the refuge prayer.
Perfect. Okay.
Yeah. I'm sorry for letting Rinpoche wait.
It's okay. It's okay.
Would love to offer tea. Perhaps it. Thank you, Rinpoche.
Sweet tea.
Sweet.
Has Rinpoche been well? Losar Dachi delay Rinpoche? Late.
Happy Tibetan New Year.
Yes. Late wishes for the Tibetan New Year. I hope Rinpoche has been well.
Thank you. Thank you. I am very glad. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Rinpoche, for joining us during this very auspicious time. Thank you so much, Rinpoche, for making time.
Most welcome. Most welcome.
So I think we can start.
Osashi Perki Chokchi Metrop Tram Rirap Lingzi Nide Gyempadi Sangye Zindu Mikteo Wayi Trokun Namdak Zingla Chepa Shok. O holy and perfect pure Lama, from the clouds of compassion that form in the skies of your Dharmakaya wisdom, please release a rain of vast and profound Dharma, precisely in accordance with the needs of those to be trained. Idam Guru Ratna Mandala Kamnyayatayami.
Sanje Jedang Zoje Jonang La Shanju Bardo Dani Jozu Agi Chuje Jive Zonanje Ndola Binjir Sanje Ndogo Sanje Jedang Zoje Jonang La Shanju Bardo Dani Jozu Dagi Chuje Jive Zonang Ndola Binjir Sanje Ndogo Sanje Jedang Zoje Jonang La Shanju Bardo Dani Jozu Dagi Chuje Jive Zonanje Ndola Binjir Sanje Ndogo Amo lai ge dan du dan ni ge jumbo da dan mi ge nan dan do gun ju jan ji dan tan je ge do da ge chu den do da dari lu da bebe lu su ji ba yin na bebe ge du dan ji ba yin na lu se ba sha di yo re lu se ba sha ji ji dari ni ma ju da da chi ma re dari bi su ju ro bi su ju de yang ci bo sang bu jin yang zi wo re and Losar ya shar jejine da shama taba sumsi da Losar shar jejine ngarang su chunju ji ya de nang ni da tiwo chimbi shong shangju simbi shong Lojong gi shong din de ji cheni ji gi gugen din de ji chong bo di be jiao sang bu chong si gan yin sin di shong di Lojong gi shong di che bu ren ju Lojong gi shong di shong xin da 당 민자유 미세기 체슈 망부요래다. 지당雄신다라 쿠랑쿠랑기 개추 튜무만 비추 망부요래. 근데 뭐 딜라 튜무만 비 가랑수 센라. 제가 진주도 당야당 다 생기 나로라지 계제도 마송은 미카시 계제시 디가 생각나 수부시부지도 계제디 수지지 생각만 수지지네 또 편부시부시도 오 디순듯이 로션 된데마디 난 딘데기 체주 미세 외대버 딘데시래샤 진짜 딘데기 추디 신이지에 그거 좀 어디 된다 된바 핀도 여봐 로션 된데마디 렌지마도 마대버 있는데 비 시라기 카요라요기 핀도 여대버시 지오시마도 새로 만보다 라노메베 샹주기 고방 투야라 타른비 투네 핀도 여메 디 부장 진부 계절이 내주지리 디장 마세베 단다 카웨라요 카두랑 니리니리기 생 도스 생기 디와당 이디와 시디마라바 지진이 세마주바 지진이 디와네야라 카웨라요 핀도 여대바다 루션 된데마 디 나로라 송베 계제 수제디 디 륜이 상바시 Dimi demba ina kardin sansan sunachi. Dile demba chi kawayu sansan suni. Dindegi be si zambu dinde yore yes. Chezan di ngansu dindegi shongji la cheni che chungba di gyao sambu chogdus di shira gugo yabu chinbu chogdus.
Yes. Well, today the teachings Rinpoche will give are, of course, on the occasion of the Tibetan New Year, which started 10 days ago. 10 days ago, the Tibetan New Year, it was the first day of the Tibetan New Year. Today is the 10th day, so the 10th of the Tibetan calendar. And on this auspicious occasion, Rinpoche will teach the Dharma. We'll connect it to the Dharma on this occasion by way of teaching, giving a teaching on the mind of enlightenment, or connected to the mind of enlightenment, a type of teaching which is part of the genre that is called mind training, Lojong, or mind training. And Rinpoche feels we're very fortunate. We are very fortunate to have this opportunity to receive these teachings on this very special text on mind training. This particular text, this Lojong text, has many great qualities, unusual qualities in comparison to other texts that are, well, part of the Dharma treatises, Dharma texts. And they have this special quality of affecting our mind in a very profound way. Rinpoche compares it to someone talking in a way that really pierces your mind, that really affects your mind in a very profound way, in a very beneficial way. Similarly, here, these teachings of mind training, they have this incredible benefit on our own mind. So we should consider ourselves to be fortunate. We are fortunate to receive a teaching on something so meaningful, a meaningful text, in the sense that it helps us in our daily life. It helps us in our daily life right now. It helps us in our future. It helps us in future lives. And it helps us to reach the enlightened state of a Buddha. So for a long time, it actually benefits us in the long run. On top of it, it's a very practical text. It's very practical in that it helps our mind to train our mind. And in that way, also, it benefits our mind greatly. It benefits our well-being. We feel better that way. We'll be happier. We'll be more content. And therefore, what is greater than that? Than these auspicious words, these really positive, beneficial words. So these are all the reasons for why Rinpoche feels we're very fortunate to, well, learn about this particular Lojong text, or text on mind training.
다 루션 된데미 숑디 고라 미세기니 숑쿠란디 중화 루주 디고라 미세기 도나 슈에스 마종 아이나 나준 용자기 송대야당 용자기 계제 디왕의 제바이나 루션 된데미 숑디라야 벽이 나올라 녀마 마비디 비디 민다 지금 마무주여 간다 Pity. Cosa?
Pity? Quando eu sempre começo.
Mabi. Lojong tendemi pijetila. Lojong tendemi pijetila. Ya, mabi slawe na dire. Toz mindawa.
Nas.
Si toz mindawa. Ya,
ale kutsas.
Kurinti mindawa. Zawa di yo dos.
Nas.
Zawa yo banda. Din digala da gagi. Lojong tendemi shong 치 고렌당 숑 민다오 유버 디조 나올라 가기 다바래 가리 마다버에서 근데 지 다마다기 체버디 슈두 위에 시마송디 칸드라 민다오 유버디 차티샤 다 민다오 유베 나올라 다리 나랑수기 도스 베제 동대디 스르치 빈죄네 빠진지 나도 디 시샤지진의 슈규 디양고랑 야우지도 다디 마인베 양 기딘베 라랭기 숑 카시에기 나로라 루존 든든미기 자와기 시디 나조 다리기 베제 단에 디당 찌기 고렌디 중세 민다와 양 치데즈 민다와 고렌 민다와 치쿠랑 도즈 민다와 근데 용디도 스타인의 디년가게 통금도 된다랑기 돈이 집은들 된다 조디라 체버게 루문도 다 로종 된되미기兄弟 지난 나중 용다 가당베 기시 체가와 연제버레세지 딘데기 송수지 요래 제버부디 가당베 기시 체가와스 지지니 지기 요래디 얘네양 남준 송준지런디 송요래 간들 로종 된되마디 된되미기 된다 된요로 로종기兄弟기 된다디 조지네 여봐 조지 빠딩 아디샤 공기 코랑기 로마 야온종 덴발라 지 까자마치 까자마스라 용디간라 용다마이바 상와치시니 도시시 송야디 난기요레스 다 조지네 마 가사 종 덴바네 마 코랑기 로마 초라 나야디양 로마 구치주지시네 녀드롱 요 로마 지니라 나야마도 초기 나로라 나야디 난기요 마레스 아니 rondenbe 코랑기 로마 부두알나 부두에 랑리 타바당 아니 샤라원이나 도시 나지 체가에 봐도 말이 체가 오기 가사가사 샤라오기 코랑기 로마디 체가 오라 어디래시 샤라에 체가 오라 나야 다 체가에 거라 디네 디나마레스 숑자진부디 미카셰지라 마도마나바 있는데 치엔뢰기니가 도산 아니 용다나샤바레스 디인디간라 체가엔 제버레스 이시네 딘데기 송준순르지 페지 딘데지 군에 용디기 위해서리 이버순르지 오 딘데너지리샤 디디추바이나
That's true. Now, with regard to this text, the mind training text Rinpoche will teach here today, which you'll find if you go to the chat, you'll find a way to receive the text for yourself. Well, with regard to this text, to say a little bit about its history, Rinpoche says he doesn't know that much about the history of this text, but just what is well known. Now, with regard to this particular text, there are actually many different versions of it. There's not just one single version that has been passed down, but there are quite a few different ones. Different in the sense that sometimes the order of some of these lines is different. Sometimes certain lines are omitted in some texts, they're added in other versions, and so forth, accounting resulting in having all these different versions. Now, the version Rinpoche used here, use here, and is also being made available to you in English, is based on Sarah J. Monastery's publication. Sarah J. Monastery has printed their own version, and this is the version Rinpoche will follow. And it's a really amazing text. It's great. And it's also wonderful that you have different versions. There's no problem that there are different types or different ways of presenting this text. For instance, in some of the Lamrim texts, you have maybe quotes given, or maybe the entire text is part of this Lamrim text, and you'll find the order may be different lines will be used, etc. However, Rinpoche says there's no problem because the meaning is the same. It doesn't really change the meaning in terms of what it conveys. Well, it doesn't change. And this text is said to have been composed by the Kadamba Geshe Chekawa. He was one of the great Kadamba Geshes. That's how it's said. But there's also an oral tradition. It's been orally passed down that this text actually was taught by Atisha. So Atisha gave the teachings that are presented in here and passed them down to his main disciple, the lay practitioner Drumthamba. And it was taught to Drumthamba in a kind of hidden fashion. It was not a publicly taught text, but it was taught more given as a secret teaching. And then from there, it was passed on to the other great Kadamba masters, Kadamba Geshe, so Botawa, Landritamba, Shadewa, and then eventually it came down to Chekawa, to the Kadamba Geshe, Chekawa Yishidoje. And he thought to himself, if this text is just passed down to a few people, because the idea was it was not appropriate for a wider audience. This could only be practiced by a few people. But if this tradition continues on of teaching it in secret, of teaching it only to a few people, it may get lost. which is why Geshe Chekawa would therefore started teaching it more widely. So this is the oral kind of explanation that is given.
Buddha Juve Korendang Shongi Kola or Tindegi Sondang Minda or Tinde Tadi Yongdu. Da Yine Taring around Sugi, Shuegi, Lojong Tundimi Shondi, that Tunda Dundi. Dundi must long the Zay Dun Dunyo. Zadundi Dunyori. That Dundi Kuran Katu dos Masuma Chagdo. Taya Tanda Munju Dama Banda Jogi Dimbi Tamba Kashaji than Lojong Tundimi Shonya Jiba Di Nandola Tomatilla Tanda Di do Chuju Shonsonre Tuji Chimbola Shaselu say Tindechi and Yongu and Di Wodilla Yang Lojong Tundimi Shongi Choju. Lojong Tundimi Shondi the Chugi Chiwa Kariores is in Chugi Chiwa Juvadi Chundilla Chiwasanari Puen Kariores Tindegi Dujinima Jambanda Sakanda Tindegi Chiwa Juvi Siji Ji Gudu Sija Kankashi Yondi do that Tandangazugi Pejetan Tilla Dikemindu Kuran Kadu Tenze Duindimandos Kadu Sumbachiresha.
Yes, Rinpoche. Now, anyway, so therefore there are these different versions of this text, and with these different versions, well, actually there are 7 points, as it's called the 7-point mind training. So it actually consists of these 7 points, these 7 topics, if you like. And in some traditions, well, some versions of this text, as they were passed down by some of the also in terms of their commentaries by some of the followers of the Gelug tradition and so forth. So in some of the commentaries, they also mention, first of all, some verses or some lines of homage, paying homage to Buddha Shakyamuni. So in some version, you find that. And then also there's this tradition, or in some texts, what is also mentioned is an expression where kind of explaining the greatness of this text. So what is so great about this text, some of the benefits of this text. So this is, in some texts that's relayed, that's explained. However, in the version Rinpoche is following here, you don't have any of that. There's no homage, there's no explanation of the greatness of this particular text, but it kind of delves right into, it kind of dives right into these 7 points.
Lojong Tundimi Shong Kurangi Joja Zudi Shiza Dindenda Chiganga Yondi do Zayang Aransu Lojong Tundin Mas Yeson Yonding Lojong was Saint John was it Nasu Ludi Jongures. That Jong said Dilla Tandangasu Dan Lukar Jongure Kare Kumpit Tangure, Kariman, Mevosugur, Noto Tangure say, Tenda Teneda Chiro. That DJ Duganga, Naransu Sanlu Nanlola, Nansugi Saint Madio chicken, Naransu Dunya chicken, Sin Didan, Shima Tadala Dunya chini, Saint Dunya chini, Lu Dunya chini, that Digi Jutsu di Karchadi. That Jutsu di Tatu Suna, Jida Jujin Mambu Yore, Juda Jin Mambu. Di Nanlola, Mateji in Tatu Suna, Zuji di Ranjinzin, Rani Jinzin, Rani Jibu, Zunzin de Chiro, Injigi Nanlola Karsa,
self-centeredness.
Audio.
Self-centeredness.
Audio. Self-centeredness, audio. Ichi, that you manager, Nasula Dubutani. Naransugi, Sandu di Mevaina, Sound di Ranshingi Nasusen Lady or Timena, you am into Sansa Tingordi, Sanjegi Tingasul Dubutangi Resum Goro, di Chiri. That di Ganga, Dadan Simbilu. Nas, Nadi, Naranguni Truansim, Narao Simba, Kanda Naun Hambe, Ransu Tubadan, Damber Trubadan, 20 Muni, Rangi, Yuji Muni, Pumbi Muni, True. Drubi na yubaran zembe dangzen tinji dangzen ti da da di chuji dangze kansa ge dang di nani kansa ge dang ji da mari bodi o da dini ni budi ro sinjin tanji ngarang zu chama du le jakin nga zu le du dang kin gi jin za zu di o dire nga wu nyan be lu chi le sha ne cha dang ji yu do nga le ya wu chi gi do nie ya wu tong nga le nyu ji gi do si ji ne cha dang dang en da na xin cha dang ni la tin ne nga je da cha do da da nyu mo xin di ji chang ma ku ren be xin do ku do ji yu go ji ne ge su su de du su su la wo di da din di gang la da lu jung he de kar jung go s la yin di gang la ran jin zen dang dang zen ni di jung go da di ku me su go ro da jung se di ku jang war che me ba su la ku chu re yang jung se lojong chi se ro chi den da ne ga ke mi do gang de da jin zen dang ran jin zen ni bu di ma shu chung ru dang di ba yo dang da jin zen gi ka de nim bu di da me ba du be da me du be shiro di na ni ha dong gi shiro di la lao chi chi ne di gong chi chi ne di gong bi de da ran jin zen nga zo ni ba jing de ro di ka de di la xin jin zen xin le pen bu de be xin le pen be sang bu chi ji ya xin jin zen gi lu gu ne gong de bi ji da de ju zen na zu bi gu ne gong gu ma to le la wi zan yong go ma ju zen na zu ba sang dang ba yin de jun ju ne song be ri ba dang da na xin gi jun ju nang lu song be xin jin zen kan de su gong be cui di jun ju ne xiong dar gong ba yin na din din yo dang du xie zang rang jin zen shu chung dang rang jin zen dan da shu chim shu yo di shu chung dang xin jin zen gong ne gong de bi o da di lu jong jong se gi lu jong be ge le jia ji zu di da di sang dang gu di che gu di yin di gang la da se bu shira cha so lu jong se di kar jong go na lu nim ba di na ni nim be za wo dan ba xue ni bu di ma shu chung di nim bu di ha shu chi da di lu jong ya di jong be chu di jong ya di o di da jong se gi jong be chu di jong gu be ju sen ka la di la da gi la bu di ma jong na nga zu sin di de xima ta da le feng jong ba yin na sin di de xima ta da le di wo ta du na din de di wo xi yong gu re ma se lu jong gi nyang ni nie de pin bu ji yong na ko ye le nie be jin nga ra zu yin chang ma du ye ran xie re dan de sang zam li nang lo la ma chu ne gang yan na zu ba ji che di do din je yi ne da ji wo le yue ne yang se ma chu ba ji ji ne xi di le nie tui ju yuan do xie zang di yuan di ku lu jong gi ding ding di su du re din de yin di lu jong be cui di lu jong se gi jong ya di ka re si na gong du xu ba di re jong gu be ju zhen di yang di nang lo le tuan song
Now, with regard to the title of this text, well, actually, what is the main topic? And the main topic becomes clear when we look at the title. The title being the 7-point mind training. Now, here, 7 points of what? Training the mind. This word in Tibetan, actually, mind training, has two meanings. It means purifying the mind, but it also means training the mind. Now, this sense of what is being trained, what is being enhanced here in terms of increasing something and decreasing something else. What is it exactly? It's the mind. The mind is being trained here. So we train the mind, we train the mind now, we train the mind of the future, of the next life. We train the mind, and mind in the sense of also affecting the body. Because of our suffering, because we suffer, we have problems, mental problems, we have physical problems in this life and future lives, etc. And what is the main cause of our problem? Well, it's self-centeredness. That is the main cause. Our self-cherishing attitude, our self-centeredness, that is the main cause for all our trouble. And we may have a sense that, well, we naturally have self-centeredness. We need this self-centeredness. However, actually, self-centeredness, although it arises for us, it arises for us naturally, it is the main troublemaker, is that which causes all our problems. Without it, we wouldn't suffer. On top of that, there's also another type of mind, another type of consciousness, which is described as self-grasping, as a type of awareness which holds on to a self that seems to exist from its own side, self-sustaining, having the self-sustaining existence, exists in and of itself. It exists within the aggregates, within the mental and physical well, mind and body, kind of the combination of mind and body. And that is a type of self-grasping that's sometimes also described as the kind of grasping at the transitory collection. So in other words, is the ignorance of holding on to a self. And that is the main troublemaker. That is the troublemaker of all sentient beings, those two, self-grasping and then the resulting self-cherishing or self-centeredness. So there's this constant thought, someone has helped me, has helped my friends, has helped me, has harmed my friends, etc. And that leads to attachment, aversion, arrogance, and all sorts of other delusions, all sorts of other afflictive states of mind. And that is because our mind is not trained, it's not purified, it's not trained. So what are we trying to purify it? What do we want to purify? We want to purify self-grasping and self-cherishing or self-centeredness. Or if we use the other meaning, mind training. So the translation of the Tibetan word Lojong, so to train our mind, well, it means to transform self-grasping, to transform it by way of understanding that the self doesn't exist the way we hold on to it, understanding selflessness, and therefore replacing our self-grasping mind with wisdom, understanding reality. In particular, a wisdom that is a union of a very calm state of mind and a special insight into how the self really exists. And so based on that, based on such an understanding, also to increase our cherishing or our attitude of cherishing others instead of just cherishing ourselves, to want to benefit others, to put others' welfare before our own welfare. And there are many reasons for doing so. There are many reasons for why we would actually cherish others and let go of our self-centered attitude. And many of these reasons you find, for instance, in Chantideva's Bodhisattva way of life. They are described in there. And so many reasonings that we need to have, many reasons that explain why it makes sense to cherish others more than cherishing ourselves. And based on that, we can actually change. Right now, our self-cherishing is pretty strong. However, with this training, with this mind training, we can reduce it. We can actually train ourselves. We can train ourselves to reduce self-cherishing, reduce our self-grasping, that is, weaken it, and apply, well, by way of applying the antidote to the self-grasping mind and applying the antidote to our self-cherishing mind. That is the way we actually train our mind. And why? Why should we do this? Well, it's necessary for the happiness, for the well-being we experience in this life and in our next life. And of course, it's also necessary in terms of ultimate happiness, lasting happiness, because through this, we can attain this lasting happiness. And while in samsara, we see there's so many problems. There is war, there are other conflicts, there's so many problems. And why? Because of those two states of mind. And this is why it's necessary through mind training to reduce and eventually totally eradicate self-grasping and self-cherishing or self-centeredness.
다기 공라 가수 쉬야기 다든 짐비 루이 님부 돈이 도베 싫어 된당 상주지 신 공수지 된당 상주지 신 종수지 당 아니 랑진진지 님부 신진진 상베 고년 공주 상주지 신 종수 니낭로라 딘루워 된다 딘디 디니낭로로 딘루워 다 Lojong Düchen ma nalo la ngela ma song yong diga la ambu di ngonju di song gonzu xiangju ji sen jongwa da danda xiangju ji sen jongwa ni bu di nguxi le xia ne di yi duen dambu di la sen ni bu di jongyu ngonju yu chu di song di duen ji le xia da di ne nguxi di gonzu xiangju ji sen ga sa danda xiangju ji sen jongwa da gonzu xiangju ji sen jongwa ni nang lu di lu da di ni bu di la duen sen zhu yo le duen sen zhu di dan di nang lu la 무시 상주의 생종와 다나 생기经验想就让的就是刺激两年之内点不塞的路用的当时路用的老家路用别吃路用之间呢哪些个子用之间呢 공지 야부 티에지니 루 종주보로 종종종지 타마디 장베 뉴바디 용수 주용디가라 루디 종 셈바 루 종베 체스고다 루 장셈베 체 루장 셈바다 루장베 뉴바템바이나 체 간데지 레고고 세기 룬종베 체딩야 오 딘데기 된생 디 디레스.
Now, with regard to these 7 points, well, they actually can be summarized. These 7 points of mind training can be summarized into two aspects. One is as well the aspect of the ultimate awakening mind, ultimate bodhicitta or ultimate awakening mind, which is an antidote to self-grasping. So it's the antidote to self-grasping in the sense that it is a mind that realizes emptiness, a wisdom that realizes emptiness, that realizes selflessness. Rinpoche mentioned it early on. So this mind that realizes the opposite of the self that the self-grasping mind perceives, that is selflessness or emptiness, and that is described here in the form of the ultimate awakening mind. And then secondly, you have the conventional awakening mind, conventional bodhicitta or the conventional awakening mind, which is the antidote to self-cherishing, to the self-cherishing attitude or the self-centered attitude. So everything in this text can be summarized into those two, ultimate awakening mind and conventional awakening mind. And then when you look at these 7 points themselves, well, first you have a presentation of the preliminaries, the basis for this text. And then the remaining 6 points, they set forth the 2 types of bodhicitta, or the 2 types of the awakening mind, ultimate and conventional, in the form of, well, training in the awakening mind, the main practice, then taking adverse conditions onto the path of enlightenment. That's the 3rd point, presentation of a lifetime's practice in summary. And then it continues on presentation of the measure of having trained the mind. So for instance, if we train the mind, we are training the mind right now until we reach a state in which we have trained the mind. And what is the measure of having trained the mind? So what does that mean? To what degree have we trained the mind? And then, of course, the last 2 points as well of commitment and precepts of training the mind.
지당 로종 된된마기 치디제 제디 나무로 된다 망부지 치디 치뉴뉴뉴뉴렌도 지금 치지긴 지세자야라야 치디 나무로 예비 된다 차상만도스 지세자야라 뒤수 시우중 고야래샤 인디가나다 다른 안수 로종 된된미 된다 된요래 된다 딩부디 된베 로종 된된미기 자유치 다 가실라 지간 진니마도 매바 가실라 지간 망부 요버인데 요래 딩인디가나 숑 나된디 도즈 된쿠랑 주제 차네 시라 망부래라 주제기 치기 원이 시에버이나야 로종 치제마다 디주도 도즈 다게면도 데즈 치 디양 뒤서 딘주기 도시 망부 차기도 딩인디가나 아주 된다다리 지 된다 뒤뒤뒤지 디테간 디뜬고래 디테간 디뜬고래 시제지네 카쇼장 된다 간들지 된 강라 강토기 창원지버 강시지라 지 시라 제부면비 토네 지슈나 상바레.
So Rich is saying, well, actually this text there are many different meanings contained in this text. So many different, kind of aspects that are addressed here. Actually, only by way of few words. It's a relatively short text. However, it takes a long time to address all these different aspects, all these different meanings. It would take a long time, which is why Rinpoche doesn't have the time to do so today. And therefore, Rinpoche will just go through some of the the main kind of points, to just kind of go through them. And some of these points have just a few lines that explain these points, and others have more. There are more verses, more lines that explain these different points. But Rinpoche won't go into all of them. He won't go into all of them, but just give you like a general sense of what this text is all about, just because of the lack of time. And this text is quite different to, for instance, the 8 verses of mind training, which is much more condensed in that sense. Doesn't require that extensive explanation. Anyway, so Rinpoche will just give you some of the essential aspects. Will explain some of the essential aspects of this text, or the essential meaning.
당부디 디레샤 된된기 나로라 당부디 문주 땡지 취 땡바스 문주 땡지 취세 디레샤 당 문주 땡기 취디 가르 라운디간라 당부 문주 달라서 당 문주 러러에 디레샤 당 문주스 라운디간 디 문주디 가르 라운디간라 장주지 생 공부디 문시를 샤바로 다 장주기 생 공부디 문시를 샤디간라 문시디 문주스 라운디간라 장주지 생 줄을 지발라 디응외도 공부야 디기 문주 장주기 생了루중와라 디기 문주라 공고비 취타다 건 내시베 문주라 샤고고 다디고 전기 주용고래 어디리 디인디가라 나주 라랭 주당나신 제디가라 장주기 생라 루중베 뇌라 나주 가르 공고르스나 기본지의 튜머에 랑라 루중에디 지고래 디응와라 기부 충모의 튜머나 루장에 지고래 다 도시에 진이 슈난 지고래 다양 수신다진의 수보이나 난준 지탄제 침배 지중국의 침배 딘데지 송고를 수수라니스 녀모바당 코에 동에지 나추 상지진에 바부 용구이 장에 매봐 수수라니 코는 코를 취상배 카도디라 생랑 구주 간에 대매봐 초 간에 매봐 수수라니 코는 코주상에 초 간에 매긴기 미지라스 新考呢，可最上去呢，新牛毛被希望进，因最上呢，你三能过去贴不的，用米西巴嘞是，我的送不的。第一地方了，他想去个先生的，哪个的那边申请了明年，第多年是拿最上，牛毛被希望的去年多年拿最的，上眼地下过了，他想去个三公的地公过了嘛，干啥？想去个三公的干了，地公这些呢，如果。 디인디간 디응외라 라니 코에 동에지 나추 라니 코에 나로로 코르추 군종 코에 주린상 바다 다나신기 두디 니미상 두 코에 동에지 니미상 라니 코나 코추 뇽무베 시왕도 주추 어디상고 디인디간라 민종 공부 못 당스는 디거다 민종디 문주기 출샤 문주디 어디 디네더지로 구구고레스.
Now the first point, it says in the text, presentation of the preliminaries, the basis. And the explanation that is given is, well, first train in the preliminaries. Now the question is, what are those preliminaries? Preliminaries to what? Well, as we've heard before, the main topic of this text is the awakening mind. It's bodhicitta, that's the main topic of this text. And so what are the preliminaries to training the mind in bodhicitta? What are the preliminaries to generating the mind of enlightenment or the awakening mind? Now, according to the Lamrim, if you follow the sequence of the Lamrim, of the teachings on the Lamrim or the graduated stages of the path to enlightenment, well, you have the 2 scopes. What precedes the high scope or the practices of a person of greater spiritual capacity? Well, what precedes those practices are the practices of the middling scope or the practices that are common to a person of middling spiritual capacity. And that is preceded in turn by the smaller scope. Therefore, one of the preparations, one of the preliminaries to meditating on the main topic, that is bodhicitta, would be to meditate on the different practices, according to the different practices that pertain to the 2 scopes. However, Lama Tsongkhapa, the great Lama Tsongkhapa, has talked about the fact that, well, when we generate the mind of enlightenment, when we generate bodhicitta, what do we actually do? We are concerned with the suffering, but not just the suffering of sentient beings. So we're concerned with the suffering of sentient beings, but not just that. We're also concerned with the different afflictive emotions, the delusions, and so forth that they experience. So we're concerned with samsara, how they're caught in samsara, how they're controlled by their afflictive emotions, etc. However, we will not have the sense to actually benefit others, the wish to free them from the predicament of being born in samsara, being controlled by our afflictions, unless we experience the disadvantages of samsara ourselves. We have to start with ourselves before we can generate concern for others. I mean, generate the wish to free others from samsara. Therefore, it's important, before we can actually generate bodhicitta, it is important to first concentrate on our own situation, how we are controlled by our afflictive emotions, how this gives rise to certain actions which result in suffering, how we're caught in samsara, and so forth. And then understanding those disadvantages, understanding how we're caught in samsara, generate the wish to be free from samsara and from its causes. In that way, we generate renunciation first. In other words, as a preliminary to bodhicitta, we generate renunciation for samsara, for cyclic existence.
Dadine Munshi Shanju Sin Gombatilla, Kondo Shuba Nanshin, Dana Shanju Sin Gombada, Kondo Shanju Sin Gombani Niri. That Dana Shanju Sin Gombatilla Gonshi. Twin Wishi Gosu, Chitru Gombe Sudan, Twin Sansu, Chitru Gombe Suniri. That Twin Wishi Gosu, Gombe Sudi, and that Loshan Tendemi Nangula, Dambudi. Chuna Milan Tabursan, Maji Ribeshi Leche, Nimbuni Jansu Chu, Mogunshi, Nanga Sha said, what that D, Janashan Ji Saint Gonsuti. That Diga do the Zoo, the Chuna Milan Tabursan. Naranzo Chidren Hanyu Chun di Tada, Milan Jimubu Tabu. Milan Jimubu Pen Milan Nalola, Lombuchi Tumbaina, Milan Tonshimbekala, Lambuchi, Tonyetsi, Milan Nangi Lambuchi di, Lambuchi Mune imba Tongramadu, di Lambuchi Zuma imbachi, Tongumarwa. Redi, Lambuchi Mune imba Tongatar, Duenla, Lambuchi imba Tuyo Revesna, Tuyo Mari. Milan Nalola, Lambuchi. Ru Nangu Lambuchi di, Lambuchi Mare, Lambuchi imba Naya, Lambuchi imba Madubari. Bi Dishindu, Milangi Lambuchi, Dishindu, Chu Tangi, Maransugi, Nangse Sama, Tuse Sama, Sangse Sama, Sambezi, Nanguzina, Kurangi Muni Trudevici. You eat once, you Kurangi Muni eat one, Chadi Yubachi. You eat one di, Tuma Mevane, Demane, Kurangi Muni, you want to Tuba Matu. Di yu yidong yu di le dao bi kansagi lu le dian lu pa da qi qi ne yu yong chu ba ji nga zui zao ni tong guo ma yu nga zui tong de yu yidong di nga ran su lu pa da ba zang yin ba ji zan ne mi tong wa re yu yidong di kurang gi mo ni su yidong zhu yo re sang sang zhu yue ba ji nga su nang di go nang da nga su sang go re de der sang ba le dian ne cha dang ji yu go xie zang 다 유지문이 마주바지 유크랑기 문이 이동원 마주베 주생가레스나니가 라왕기 문이 주요 말이스 뒤에 파샤고로마도 유크랑기 문이 이원이 임버 주바다 유크랑기 문이 세 칼라사에게 세 임버 주바 딘데지 유여바이나 유크랑기 문이 세 임버 주여바이나 다 딘데기 세디 나출라 세 임바나시 신진신 탕제라 세 임고래 가르라운딩알라 만주기 세임버 통데디 유크랑기 무인이 세임버 투소나 다 유크랑기 무인이 세임버 투에디 가르라운딩알라 제어치소나 디 만주기 세임버 통구도 만주기 디사디가나 만주라 세차기도 만주 두고자기도 수불의 핑기도 세진 딘데지 러그로 셰자 주진 딘데지 임바이나 쿠랑기 무인이 세임버 투지지네 만주라 세 임버 차유버이나 다 딘데기 세디 신진 탕제라 세인고 그래 가레스는 쿠랑기 문이 세임버 주자 나줄 세 나줄 밀 세 차버로 딘디간라 쿠랑기 문이 세임버 주연 신진 탕제라 세인고 그래 다디 말해 나줄 밀 뒤디 세임버디 딘딜 뒤디 세임베 니버자니 매버리 나줄라 사와이나 수불의 핀비 세 임바지라 신진 신기 misawa sanayang chugu jaya gi sela minjura subula nyobe dula junjuye dine yongdi do pechen seshu ji di du di ngazu sena ngazu le se mare ngazu su chujure ine maja tabu junjuji gi du sadigangla maja dila maja le pics mare inji mare peacock 제가 쿠란라 세 차기도 쿠란기 수부 제베 수부 야부 차야 수부 야 제베 주스 그랬다가 나중最나로도 강들 수부 제베 주 차유거래 제가 쿠란기 문이 세임버 주메 쿠란기 문이 용임버 주메 랑기 문이 수임버 주메 수 랑신 동바레 시지네 디송고 딘디간도 취나 멜랑다부상
Yes. Now, with regard to, therefore, we have to generate renunciation first, and then based on that, we then engage in the actual practice of the awakening mind. So the practice here, it starts with training in the ultimate awakening mind. And again, this can be divided into the practices you do during the meditative session, while you're meditating on the ultimate awakening mind, and then during the interval period, the period when you're no longer in this meditative session. Then again, with regard to the session here, the session when you're in the session, there are 4 lines that describe exactly what you should do when you're in the meditative session. So train to view all phenomena as dreamlike, examine the nature of the unborn awareness. The remedy too is freed in its own place, and place your mind on the basis of all, the actual path. Those 4 lines describe what you should do, what we should do while we're in the meditative session. Now, taking the first line, it says, well, train to view all phenomena as dreamlike. And an example for that would be, for instance, when you dream of, when you have a dream about an elephant. It seems that you're actually perceiving an elephant. There's an actual elephant in your room that you're dreaming about. But of course, in actuality, although it seems to be an actual elephant, it isn't an actual elephant. It's not really an elephant. And similarly, phenomena, when they appear to us, they appear to exist. They appear to exist in a way in which they don't exist. It seems, for instance, when there's an attractive object, when there's a beautiful object, this attractiveness is inherent, it's natural to this object, it's within this object, it exists from its own side. We're not aware that this attractiveness, as an example, that we perceive in relation to a particular object, that this is merely labeled by our own mind, it's merely imputed by our own mind, that we label this attractiveness. However, the way we perceive it, we believe this to be attractive in and of itself, and therefore this kind of sense of attractiveness that is conjured up by our mind, or the way we grasp at it with our mind, that gives rise to, well, attachment, aversion, and so forth. It seems that phenomena are independently existing in and of themselves, but in actuality they exist in dependence on other factors, definitely on our mind labeling this object to be attractive, for instance. Now, giving another example, food. It seems when you see a certain substance that we consider to be food, that we call food, it seems this food is intrinsically food from its own side. However, if that were the case, it would have to be food for all living beings. It doesn't matter who it is, not just for humans, it should also be food for other sentient beings. For us, it seems this is objectively something we can eat. It's objectively something that fills us, that satisfies us, and so forth. But if it was inherent in that particular substance, if it was inherently food, it would be food for all sentient beings. But that's not the case. I mean, we can observe that there are certain items or certain foodstuffs that when we eat it, yes, it fulfills us, it keeps us healthy, etc. But it makes other animals sick. To give another example, if there's certain substance that we describe as poison, so we feel it's inherent in this object. It's in and of itself. It's got nothing to do with anything else. It just is poison. However, there are certain poisons, as a certain type that is usually described in the Abhidharma Kosha where it says that a peacock, when a peacock eats this particular substance that would kill us, well, the peacock thrives when he eats it. I mean, he physically, its body enhances enhances the peacock thrives on this particular poison. Therefore, if it was inherently poison, this substance that is mentioned in this text, well, then that should be the case for everyone. So this is, Rinpoche says, therefore, things do not exist in and of themselves, but independence on other factors. Yes.
那今年我让说了能有余群的他的云的他的让我的出吧天经我的出吧没把长的嘛是为遇见西吧日吧日别让心细了戒那样三块那样让心就嘛住吧这是嘛戒日别细了戒吧那样基本这是那第三的嘛是为你三个让心东北你都被陆地区为那的三界让心东北你阳明的东北你我说都被你不苦让你不一些苦让样让我呢嘛住吧这是第一地方的遇的遇见东你与你不东你都被路长马路让是主要是那个大纲的让给我呢嘛住吧对呢打吧让是主对嘛呢打吧是的第七的个这是但第一地方了我关心俺了下世纪关心俺了下世的俺让说录自己的下来的关心俺了下世关系谁的的各叔了关系他人就谁与的明着的但个人的关系谁的培训定这来样只出面着上个多东年了关系算下去的看来老问题讲的东北的通呢去年今年路他都东年西年过呢他不的东年就对嘛通不了东年了么呢考的现在关系谁的看待你给心上关系是个了俺做南京生长的逻辑关系 number 是谁的关系谁的看待你给细节越问题讲了关系是个的现在第的几百节去年生个去年以内的去年我说的同一些的结尾以内看到生个去年通呢他把投用过的马桶的考用现在今天个生个去年的去年了自己的两百下路大让第几步讲了年纪呢第一讲了年不马都难度新马不恰的日系假期呢东北你的自己的两百下些今天了不起了过去有的过去有的上个度他今天些家长电子没找到都一那七八千都提了下他第年第两下给告诉东尼公司的都是些公园的但两下来浪起去呢去电报了说吧他大那些里头就叫新界别够了东北你看的是广告了地方了全场居民基本上是全场去告诉南瓦党叔叔的康南的余地他的南京的让你他讲的去他的说那些西北去西这个去他的就没打不带起呢余地南用的讲了余地过上短期问题主办俺说的过上新的南用过的第二是公别网的南用过的第都得有嘛有可能南北因的余地南北卡多的了俺让说申请南了余地南一个了短期问题主办机构外面的南用过的公别网的连这的南我的没定吧就没基本南线就没当然南线没啷个说南线去上过的是但的全场去告诉东尼公司这些但的我的了工作想去新公司的工作想去新公司的了样要节母系节就都是些呢有送下那样这个的
Yes. Now with regard to now when we talk about emptiness now in the context of the ultimate awakening mind, well, all phenomena lack inherent existence. And if that's the case, well, that's also true for the mind that realizes emptiness. So examine the nature of the unborn awareness, the mind, the mind that analyzes, that negates intrinsic existence or existence from its own side, that itself also lacks inherent existence. Now, when we say phenomena only exist because they're labeled by the mind and so forth, well, mind itself lacks inherent existence. In particular, the mind that realizes emptiness. and of the different types of mind that realize emptiness directly, it is the mind that experiences emptiness directly. That also doesn't exist from its own side. Where here, therefore, you have the object of the mind and the mind itself. So you have object and subject. None of those exist inherently or from their own side. Therefore, it says in the root text, the remedy too is freed in its own place. Not just the object, that is all phenomena that appear to the mind, but even the mind or that are perceived as lacking inherent existence, but also the mind itself that lacks inherent existence. So it's freed from inherent existence, doesn't exist in and of itself. And then the text continues to say, place your mind on the basis of all, the actual path. Now, the basis of all has many different explanations. There are many different, this term is used widely in different contexts. However, Rinpoche feels that in this context here, it can refer to emptiness itself, and it can refer to the mind that realizes emptiness directly. It can refer to both. Now, in the sense that, well, the basis of all, with regard to emptiness, when we think of emptiness, when we realize emptiness, when we see emptiness, that takes us to liberation. If we are confused about emptiness, if we don't understand emptiness, if we misperceive emptiness, well, that leads us to samsara. Therefore, it is important here, emptiness as a basis of all, but also the mind itself, the mind that is single-pointedly absorbed in emptiness, the mind that realizes emptiness directly, that could also be seen as here the actual path as the basis of all. So those are two ways of explaining it. Anyway, these first 4 lines describe the session, the meditative session that ideally would mean you experience emptiness directly. And then once you arise from that meditative session, when you just go about, do other things, engage in other activities other than meditating on emptiness, well, due to our habit, due to our familiarity with inherent existence, phenomena will continue to appear as if they existed in and of themselves, as if they were objectively existent. This will happen to all of us. It's just a natural tendency of our mind that due to our familiarity with inherent existence, that everything will appear in a certain way as existing in and of itself and so forth. Now, what should we do in that situation when we arise from the meditative state? Well, we should remember that this is just an appearance. It is similar, it's like an illusion. It's similar to the illusion that is conjured up by a magician when a magician takes a pebble and a stone or a piece of wood and have them appear as a horse and an elephant. So have certain things appear in a certain way. Or like a dream, where in a dream you have the appearance of an elephant. In the same way as they don't exist in the way they appear, well, phenomena do not exist in the way in which they appear to exist in and of themselves. And this we should remember when we're in this interval period between meditative sessions. Then the next part of the text explains the training in the conventional awakening mind. And again, there's like an or in this case, you have like an introductory kind of phase. You have the actual meditation and you have the conclusion.
Only Nimbu Bimmer Jang, Dini Long the Jumper Shas Yine, Song Gudo, that Tony Nidi Langsang Gongyachi, Zao Nangula, the Jun Gordi, Tony Chi Miba Chevala, the Ingedilla, Jidani Chimbu, Lang Chichong Nanglola, Nue Dambo, or Dire, Dambo Dambodilla, Danyong Gomatiche, Dani Bama, Song the same number Chet, Chadangi Lum Numbati Pa. Gachi Sine, Dani Bamason Sinjin Tadalo, Lumba Doyagi, Danyong Gumbati, Dijila, Ran Jinzinji, Juan Gutumani Sambaji, Dijila, Shin Jinzinji, Yandin Gutumani Sambaji, Sumbati, the Shibatilla, Dashin Gio Muisi, Dashin Gio Muiti, such a Shibati, that's such a Nabadilla, Pichi Tuba inside it. 당뇨 공부때 당불 지바이나 다 주바딜라 돈행기 미바체 다 돈행디 주바딜라 리고레 디 원주스네 디응외딜라 다신냥지기 군에 루종국요 인디간라 토머 당뇨 당뇨디 사지다브로 디네 랑진zen 주엔상 신진zen지 연대상 다신지 랑진 신진이 구도 다신지 원의 어디 사지 시제 안에 시리자 디지로 동네 공부 사진가 오도시지니래 다디 다신냥지 등외로 만주어이나 동네 카도랑상 공야 딜레장 다신냥지기 상로디 응외로 당내 디지라 동네기 미버디 제버이나 고 미버디 내든 주치와당 동네기 냥내디고 미버지와 장마이바 세나다지 나와차디야 맞아 비저기 디문다와술레 딘데 장마이바 오네기 신띠니 파동투에도 출린투에기 니더지 레야라 당부 라는 치종네 지단이 치미 숨바다 오 사지 디주 실러샤베토니 공자와이나 디야부용구에서레스 오다디레 동네세디 우파 동베거라 랑기 두송의 사베 기와 랑기 류 롱슈 다 랑니의 유베 리베 차 단다 유바 두송도 랑니라 다 마라 유바 단다 유바 마음벌 유버는 주와 타다 파동야 티 신진신 나가다 네베 신진의 파동야 다 렘베 카도딜라 신진신지 동에다 이미디와 류동야와 신 이미디와 딘제기 쭌기 차 타다 수 미베 렌지지니 미 근데 미바지지니 미바 이제지 군이 수 렌지지니 랑기 띵도 해송 상배 미바지 동네기 나니 근데지 지고래
너스부지 나 동네기 나니 겔라 뜻이겠네 야두라 잘 가신 동네 남내 콘서 구추 마다스라 당부질라 다가시 고마 트윈사라. So I will start now and ask Rinpoche for permission to do so, to give you the last explanation Rinpoche gave, just for it to be clearer. So Rinpoche says the next step is now the training in Tonglen, which is the Tibetan word for giving and taking, the practice of giving and taking, or Tonglen. What does that mean? Well, Rinpoche, that's the last explanation Rinpoche gave. Well, it means that when you give, give means that you actually, when you breathe out, when you, as part of your breath, breathing in and breathing out, when you breathe out, you visualize that everything positive in your life, everything positive of past, present, and future, all the good aspects of your life, you give to others. So in terms of virtue, for instance, the virtue you accumulated in the past, the virtue you're accumulating right now, and the one you will accumulate in the future, all your happiness and well-being, all this you give to other sentient beings. You visualize, you give it to all sentient beings who, in terms of their numbers, are like space. They're space-like in that they're endless sentient beings, and you give it to all of them. And as you breathe in, you visualize that all the suffering of sentient beings, you take it on, all their trouble, all their problems, all their difficulties, their afflictions, etc. All of this you take on. And you have that sense of believing, I'm really taking it on. So it's not just make-believe, but you actually, it's not like you're going through it as if you were watching a movie or something, but like from the depth of your heart, you're determined to take on the suffering of sentient beings. And with each breath, you do this practice of Tonglen, giving and taking. Now, Rinpoche said, this is the actual practice which is described already in the first line. However, we are not ready to do this right away. We need some preparatory kind of practices that precede the practice of Tonglen, which are not mentioned here, but which are mentioned by Lama Tsongkhapa in his Lamrim. In his Lamrim, or in his different Lamrim texts, Lama Tsongkhapa talks about 4 steps, 4 kinds of meditations that have to precede the practice of Tonglen. The first one is you need to generate equanimity. Equanimity in the sense that with regard to all sentient beings, to reduce our attachment towards some and our aversion towards others, more of a sense of openness towards all sentient beings. So this kind of not being partial in terms of sentient beings, but having a sense of equanimity towards all sentient beings. That's the first step. The next step is we need to spend some time meditating on the disadvantages of or on the faults of self-centeredness, the self-centered attitude. That's the next step. Number 3 is to meditate, to become aware and to meditate on the good qualities of cherishing others. And number 4 is actually exchanging ourselves, putting others' happiness before ourselves. So exchanging ourselves with others in the sense that instead of being mainly interested in our own happiness, we now are mainly concerned with the happiness of others. So actually equalizing ourselves with others. Those are these first 4 steps we need to meditate on. And then we engage in this practice where we visualize taking on the suffering of other sentient beings. That is, first giving our own happiness, our own well-being, all our good qualities, and taking on the suffering of other sentient beings as we breathe in and breathe out. If we do it with these first 4 steps, then our practice will become effective. It will come from the depth of our heart and not be superficial, as if we were just visualizing this, as if we were watching a movie.
다신양지기 군의 루중야기 문식이 냥니 차디 거래. 다신양지 군의 상주주의 생제비 냥닝기 문시순들이 차임도 다디지. 다 돈인디 고디 된다 뒤뒤 취원 다른데. 다디 문식이 냥닝 순들이 공자에 뒤조지. 다 디다 문식이 냥닝 디 남베거라 다 춘상스 같이 고르세디 다 뒤준도 같이 근데기 다진양지 군의 상주주의 신 제비 출라스는 지금도 간다 다진양지 군의 상주주의 신 제비 토디라 루중비 딜 냥린 농킹기 낭킹기 강사 디기 문시 냥린 디 낭치시네 다 뒤준도 상동다디 간대치 고고래 양면의 춘상스 간대치 고고스라운디가라 다 춘상스 냥린 나야디라 망부지레디기도 춘상기 자오디 망부시라로 그래서 춘상기 자오던 지위 냥린 나야디 망부지용도 딜라 당부디 유송 두송 기자송 디리 다 유송 두송 기자송스라운디가라 빼나 유송의 체베거라 유송스라는 유이동어 이동명어 이동명어 가야만 뭐 바마 디송리 다 두송스라운디가라 유이동어 통용디가라 뇌샤지 용거래 이동명어 통용디가라 시당지 용거래 바마 통용디가라 당용거래 디 두송리 다 두송의 띠니 기자송스라운디 기자송디 가라운디가라 다 딜라 빼차샤바이나 유이동어 미네 뇌샤지비 거라 뇌샤지바디 문진버체시네 오단 뇌샤지송 뇌샤기 루디기 랑신 풍버치기리 디인디가라 디다비 루디 루디 랑신 신진 탄지 수주라 주라양 마지버추치 로 마지워쇼 마지버 다기자 디드 제뉴바 라마하이 신지러도수 라메 신지러 상제 신지러도수 도시 상바이나 다 유송의 때에 도송지요의 도송지버 디기 진제네 야 편매 상바지야당 간들 기자수야기 진을 봐 주야쇼로 딜라 기자송세디 오디레 뇌자집이 거는 딘데 상다 시당집이 가도 딜레 오다 시당디 유이도 명의 때에 시당지 손의 시당지버디 리버제네 시당 딜레 때에 다기 주 통어치기리 다기 주 주버치기리 신의 뉴버치기리 딘디가는 디다비 루디 랑신 신진 탄지 주라 미지워쇼 지워 마주지 로 미지워 다기 자오 다기 체뉴버 신지로도 수지 자오세다 제베티들 신지로로 나스 오 차당 지버디 기자 수비 털어 봐 줘야디 다 딘데 난고레스 디지체 다 디자는 마세베捐lan공도 치기 중세들이捐lan공도 치기 중송디가라 문시 다신양지 공야 디장만 임바체 가와 침바 이날에 가르치바 이날에 칸이 찌된지 다진양지 찌들의 된지니 다진양지 찌배는 준주 나로로 송바나신 지딘 되어지니바 디겐 신딘 되려신 지딘 동해지니바 디게 랑딘 되려신 마다 제듯이 시에다 지시고 시원한 도진 니니진이 제바 뒤송에 간다 다진양지 찌 다나신기 준주기 나로로 찐디 할레빈 뉴버침부주어래 딘데지 송요 지다 미니마나 시버 공문이 된다디리 나주 미요라 칼라수야기 사시 시버 미 동지진이 자구고로 칼라 차부수고로 그래서 게시처랑기 미기 랑기 라바치비 동해디 파까고 교여이나 미디 파까고 그랬어 처랑기 민바데디 마가바이나 미디 라바치비 동해디 까도 말 미디 바긴 민나 라바장바이나 라바치비 동해디 꾸랑신기 용거였어 그래서 미기 라바치비 동해디 민되어이나 디까닌 되어이나 미디다 파타른 부치시네 라바츠 랭고 그랬어 그래서 미 마가바이나 미기 라바치야디 까도 말어 디비지 된다디라 가르슨 거스나 지도 미니스보본 디진스로 다 진진디 마방바이나 저랑 동해 까도 말했어 라니 등명을 제다 랑라 단다다 마음에 내거서 동해 용한테 자원이 까도 말했어 제자 디 비더 되니부디 자네 상동디 간다 지 센라 수부순의 용디기도 간다 딘제기 치tin데 상다 아니 지스 나가 내봐다 로지스 내주봐 다디 치디 디 나좀도스 상로 마담지지니 칸네 러버이나 디시라스게 민도 년가게 맹이순듯이 시라시라 초게 생기 나로라 생구주대 지당 생나로라 아지지 딘데다 간다이나 상상 생나베 할레버지 디게 용구민도 다 이나 상루지 당바 이나리다 지시 나가 내바당 세기 시디상 당용디간다 베 나가 마동기 바 나가 동바로 동에스게요 나가 마동기 바 야미나 다디 된다 가르치고 왔으나 신진 지시 신진 유바 디시 두스 왔다 신진디 코에네수 신진 유바 디시 두 아니 진로지 디시 두 수수라니야 코는 내지시네스 뇌로 수수 두와지 제부다 디부여서기 사제지라 루진 두스라위나 국가 중바이나 랑산디 국가디 레네 조야순데 많이 봐 코에 나로라 신지 지마도 하면 있는 코에 내수 신지 유바 디시도 수수라니야 디다 냥도를 내지시네 지시 나가 내버는 로지시네 디시 다 내지는 로에든서 디시도 수수 내는 로에 동에 참아 시야긴 긴디 로 수수기 쿠투버 슈시시네 다 뒤지시 봐도 뒤다도 쓰거든 다 뒤다도 신진기 된지지 타제 용디간라 다리 신진기 내가 디제 투문도시 미지지 나로라 루동다지 나로라 신진기 된지 투문도시 신슈 차야디 미도디 다 뒤다도 신진기 된지대로 제가디 할레베 시지구 차부치도 제가 시기 종스런디간 칸네 시장부디 주 쪼르지네 다진양지기 치당 동능기 치디 주 쪼르지네 치 칸네마 쪼르지네 루종야디양 제구래 디이네 핀두 친구 용그레스 어디 송바리
Now, with regard to, therefore, these practices, the four that Rinpoche just explained, practicing in equanimity and so forth, they're like the preparation. Those are the preparatory kind of practices we need to engage in. And then you have the actual practice. The actual practice, well, train in the two, giving and taking alternately, place the two stride your breath. That is the actual practice. And then the question that may arise is, well, what am I supposed to do during the interval period when I'm not meditating, in the session, like, well, the in-between session when I'm not meditating? What should I do then? What should I do always? How should I behave if I practice Tonglen? How should I ordinarily behave? And a lot of explanation is given with regard to how to act, how to practice when we're not in the meditation, when we're not actually practicing Tonglen. Here, for instance, it says there are 3 objects, 3 poisons, and 3 roots of virtue. What are the 3 objects? Well, pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral objects. something that's pleasant, unpleasant, and none of the two. What do they give rise to? Well, ordinarily, something that is pleasant is likely to give rise to attachment. If it's unpleasant, it gives rise to aversion. And if it's neutral, well, it induces ignorance. Therefore, it's important to now work with these different afflictions as they arise. So in the case of attachment, taking the example of attachment, the first step is to become aware that once you've perceived a pleasant object, you generate attachment, become aware of your own attachment, and take a moment to reflect on the faults of attachment, how harmful attachment is, and so forth. And then you generate a mind that thinks, well, just as I have attachment right now, so do have other sentient beings. May all sentient beings be free from their attachment. How wonderful it would be if all sentient beings were free from attachment. I personally will see to it that sentient beings will be free from attachment. And may all Buddhas and Lamas and so forth, may they help me to be able to free sentient beings from attachment. And in that way, you've turned it around. You turned this state of attachment, this poison, you turned it into a root of virtue. Similarly, you apply the same when there's an unpleasant object, you generate anger or aversion. Again, you do the same, become aware of your own anger. Take a moment to reflect on its faults, and then think all sentient beings experience anger. So many sentient beings experience anger, so may they be free from their anger. How wonderful it would be if they were free from their anger. I will see to it. I personally will help sentient beings to be free from their anger. And may Buddhas and my Lamas and so forth, may they help me, may they bless me so that I'll be able to free sentient beings from their anger. And in that way, you apply this also to the third poison, ignorance, and transform these three poisons into three roots of virtue. Then the text continues on to say, in all actions, train by means of words. What does that mean? It means that you should also recite certain words that support your practice. For instance, if you take the Bodhisattva Way of Life by Shantideva, taking this text, you find this verse where it says, all happiness comes from all suffering comes from the self-centered attitude. All happiness comes from cherishing others, from the attitude that cherishes others. And so this is true for sentient, in the case of, well, us as sentient beings. And then there are the Buddhas. So you see the difference between the two, compare the two ordinary beings who are governed by their self-centeredness and the Buddhas who are cherishing others. So this verse, you should reflect on, you should kind of recite this verse and kind of continuously recite this as part of your practice. So almost like a mantra recitation. Recite this verse, or recite the verse where it talks about if you suffer from being burned by fire. So when you have a fire that you use to cook food, for instance, well, if you need to handle a certain object and there's fire there, well, you can only avoid being burned by this fire if you put out the fire. So there's no other way. If that's the natural consequence of fire, that it burns you, well, you need to put out the fire. There's no other way around it. So similarly here with regard to self-grasping, if self-grasping is responsible for all of our other afflictions, such as self-cherishing, there is no other way but get rid of self-grasping. And the words that describe that in Shantideva's that talk about exactly that, we should recite them over and over again. Similarly, the one of the most famous, most popular verses of Shantideva's Bodhisattva Way of Life is, as long as space remains, as long as sentient beings remain, for as that long may I also remain to remove the misery of sentient beings. And to really to contemplate also on the words of this particular verse, to not just recite it like you would just recite anything that doesn't mean anything to you. You should feel it from your guts. You should feel it from the depth of your heart that you're really determined to benefit sentient beings. So there's something, there's this attitude you need to generate, that this is not just for a short time. No, as long as space remains. I mean, space is endless. Its duration is endless. Therefore, as long as space remains, And so forever, this is really for always. And it's important to therefore think, well, sometimes we may feel discouraged. We may feel like, how continue benefiting sentient beings? It's so difficult, etc. However, we need to overcome this sense of discouragement. Instead, be so determined, I will do this no matter what, I'll do this. So to be determined enough through the help of this verse, this particular verse that I cited last. So in this way, therefore, it says, in all actions trained by means of the words, kind of have these quotes, have them in the back of your mind, kind of recite them if you can, whenever you can, and kind of use them, utilize them to deepen your practice of bodhicitta, or the awakening mind. Knowledge.
신지 동에 랑 렘버 세디 신진 신기 동에 디 랑 렘비 미버 치베 뇌라 수수라니라 차쳔버이나 수수라니라 단데 네거스 동에 요르디 마움바나양 종주르기 동에 나츠보 유디간라 루지기 나로는 종주르기 동에 루니기 지는 중 마움바 지오지마라 랑 종주르기 동에 디수 유디간 뇌라 랑라 마움바란 종주르기 동에 디수 수랑라 rangi lutula lembe mibati ngela ches di jene ani shini sinjin shingi dunge di rangla lengi mibachi na di gondio yores odi sungu yosere.
And then the next line says, begin the sequence of taking on suffering with yourself, which means we should start with ourselves. As part of this practice, Rinpoche explained it earlier, well, we take on the suffering of all sentient beings. However, before we should start to actually meditate on taking on the suffering and the afflictions, etc., of all other sentient beings, we should start with ourselves, to think that we will take our future suffering, whatever suffering will arise next year or the year after that, or any time until we die, or all the suffering that will arise in the future, that potentially will arise in the future. Well, I'll take this on already now. If in this way we first take on our future sufferings, it becomes easier then, or more effective, if later on we take the suffering of all sentient beings.
Lojong mengi duen sumbati jingye shangcho langdo juose ta shangcho drube kansa dije chedi shangcho drube gela shangcho ji sen nyane jibe gela jingye ba chesuna kale chesuna garchi gurla ondi gan kale cheba da jingye ba garchi ba ina di shangcho drube tala pa jugu res jing kurang da jingye ba re di jing de rang la du di jing zangbu ji la pa juju ya shangcho drube jing la shangchu zhuwe lang de pa jue yores nuji dibe gang yu zi jingi shangchu lang de jurs nuji dan zambuli changma zhama shiba kacha nare gangye shada jibe ha lebe gangye chimbuji nanglo la tongde yuwa inare gangye dida rang la dudi shangchu zhuwe lang la pa jugu gures dadi judang di kare lao di gang la judang di la dangbu di len tangji chi la das lens lao ina dire ngarang suda kangye chungba ina kangye chungegi kaadi limbudi o ngala kangye chungska ngala kangye chungegi zawa di chirang la tu yus jine kangye digi kaadi ni kaadi ka nimbadi ningula pa mayu bache susu la kari kangye chungba ina re zama shiba dan jingi gwecha duja kari chungba ina tsama lenlen tangje jila dasla oni jila 지강은 주주고 그래서 디가레스는 란진진디가 수수라 자마시바의 동해 용세 상황도 수수기 생주기 란진진 란이진진 치랑기 나쁜 버리스 수수주지 란진진디기 란이 풍어지 버리스 란의 동해 나수 용해디 단대받은 나라주 나나나나나스 수수지부 상담 신산이 상담한다 잠불이 지기 된다 나가다 내면 신진 된다 자원이 상담한다 수수마도 상 동지 매버지 구수도 쉬지 되버려 어 디기 렘버스 지네 수수의 동해다 강의 중세 참말로 수수주지 다진진 랑니 진진기 제샤 시지네 중에 참마 쿠강라 주주고 그래스 디송고.
Yes. Then the third point is taking adverse conditions onto the path of enlightenment. Now, what does it tell us? It tells us, well, when we practice the Dharma, when we practice the way, when we practice mind training, as described early on, well, there'll be problems, there'll be adverse conditions that arise, and we take those problems, we take these adverse conditions, and we turn them into means to enlightenments. We transform them into conducive conditions in that they become the causes for our own Buddhahood, our own enlightenment. Now, of course, in this world, there's so many problems. Here it says, when the world and its inhabitants boil with negativity, transform adverse conditions into the path of enlightenment. There's so many problems in this world. There's so many difficulties, conflicts, etc. And these now need to be transformed into conducive conditions. So adverse conditions are transformed in such a way. And here it says, well, how do we do this? The first line that explains that is banish all blames to the single source, which is just another way of saying drive all blame into one, drive all blame into self-centeredness. So here the Tibetan word lelin is the Tibetan word. It's kind of for blame. So to blame others. So if we usually blame other people, we blame the situation, we blame the politicians, etc. So this blame, instead of blaming it onto all these other beings, really what's to blame? We should drive all this blame into self-centeredness, because what causes all our trouble, all our difficulties, they are caused by the self-centered attitude, which is therefore why so far we've not benefited others, so far we've harmed others, and that is the result for all our adverse conditions. That is all the result for all the difficulties we experience, and we should become aware of that. We should become aware that the main cause of all our trouble is our self-centered or self-cherishing attitude.
다 공라 가진 치고 공세. 다 월에 다기 딜라 릴린 탄지 랑니 지 주지 다 진생 강라 다 용디 강라 다 진지 치랑기 렘버리스 치랑기 수수 주지 다 진지 디기 수수 퐁샤 세지네 참마 다 진생 강라 카지야 카샤야디 주생 요르다 가레스나 랑라 동에 용야디 랑기 노트치 제네 랑라 동에 용고 간데 랑단 되어 요래 랑기 레가 제단지 만디베 차지 위해서 동에 용고로 다 랑기 만디바 제약이 자와디 가레스나 랑진진 디차디고 랑기 만디베 제약이 노트기 자와 제약이 진 자와지디 유네멘지디 랑진진레 랑진진 디단냥도라 단진데 랑진진이 군이 파스 지주지기 제지지니 군이기 제용고로 세상 디 주진 띵서부 요레스 주진 매버지 다스고 매버지 바장 딘데 전에 딘데 메네야 딘데 파 상구구르세 딘데 말에 뭐에니 줄라 딘데 제스고.
Yes. And so then it goes on to say, towards all beings contemplate their kindness. Well, Rinpoche says, with the self-centeredness, well, what we're doing here to drive all blame into self-centeredness, that really means to kind of focus on our own self-centeredness and feel, well, you are the one that's to blame. This self-cherishing attitude, that's why I have all this trouble. What does that mean? Well, this is not just kind of some psychological means, just some kind of method to help us to act in a certain way. No, this is in accordance with reality. There's some very profound reasons that account for the fact that self-centeredness is to blame. In what way? Well, all that which we experience is the result of certain actions, of negative and harmful actions, of mistaken action, of wrong actions. And what caused our wrong actions, our harmful actions? Well, they were caused by our self-centeredness. Self-grasping gave rise to self-centeredness. So those two are to blame. And that's a fact. That's a fact that all our trouble is actually found. The cause for all our trouble is found in self-grasping and then self-centeredness. So it's not just make-believe. This is actually a very profound fact.
다 쇼신다진의 징이 상쇼랑도 주당디 가르스나 징이마다 딘데 간데 체송들의 동반이 공지지니 생기 춘이 공지지. 다 생기 춘이의 동반이 공용디간라 생지 랑신 동바 공용디간라 동바 공배 루디고 추구 시 추구선의 차인 거로 시 추구 지템버지 차인 거로 다 추구디 창용디간라 야이 상제밥의 주지 추구 투나무 탄제 진비 추주구 디마타다의 제외 추구디 지템버선의 용디간라 다 디마타다의 제외 롱구당 롱구디 신진기 전도 주구당 다나시 디마타다의 제외 신 디유디간라 디단 지유 방배 연진디 디마타다 더 제외 침배 연디 유바상의 마스 방배 연디야 고랑신기 내용디간라 간들 구시디 구 된라 창용이 순지고로 돈이 공지지 트리나스나 가르 나온 다음 트리나 가르샤와 이너디 추구 동반이기 랑신지 매버 덴버 매버디 공바이나 추구 공바는 주래 딘데기 추구 공바디 다 구시다와세디 다랑 추구 공바 다랑고 구시다와세디 그 된다디 창디고래 다 딘데기 돈이 공바디 징이 상주 랑도 주야기 징이 상주 랑도 주야기 더 개진부지다 다나신 돈이 공바디 송알라노 매버리스 송스는 라니 송지 송코르스는 나징아서 송코르 공했던데 요러 돈이 공바디 송초도 주버리스.
And then it goes on to say, well, by meditating on illusions as the four Buddha bodies, that really means that another way to go about this is to see everything that appears, all the objects that appear to our mind, to meditate on emptiness with regard to them. So to meditate on their actual ultimate nature. And that is actually a meditation on the Dharmakaya of a Buddha. So when we talk about the four Buddhist bodies of a Buddha, one of them is called the Dharmakaya. Here it's not really meditating on an actual Dharmakaya, because the Dharmakaya is one of the four Buddhas, one of the four bodies of a Buddha, the four kayas of a Buddha. Here it's like a similitude, something that comes close to that is kind of similar to the body of a Buddha. Therefore, we meditate on the Dharmakaya. Meditating on emptiness means to meditate on the Dharmakaya of a Buddha, which in actuality is really a similitude of a Dharmakaya. And if we meditate on the Dharmakaya of a Buddha, which is one of the four bodies, we also meditate on the other bodies of a Buddha, which doesn't just refer to the Dharmakaya, the lack of, the mind of the Buddha, the lack of inherent existence of the Buddha, and so forth. Well, it also refers to meditating on the Svabhavakaya, the Sambhogakaya, and the Rupakaya of a Buddha. So in other words, it means you also meditate, when you meditate on the Dharmakaya of the Buddha, the emptiness as like meditating on all phenomena, you meditate on the Dharmakaya, but at the same time, you meditate on the different emanations of a Buddha in the form of a Sambhogakaya or a Rupakaya. And at the same time, you also meditate on the elimination, the cessation in the continuum of a Buddha, the cessation of afflictions and so forth, which is like meditating on the Svabhavakaya. Therefore, by meditating on emptiness, meditating on all phenomena that are like illusions, you meditate on the four bodies of a Buddha. And emptiness, meditating in that way, that emptiness is protection unsurpassed. So if you meditate on emptiness, you're truly protected. We think of the protection, we may kind of supplicate certain protector deities and so forth in order to be protected. But the real protection, that is emptiness, or the meditation on emptiness. Yes.
다 다기 공기 슈바 디제제디 상루 당치지네 진인버디 상주 주비 진도 파주고로 샹라 여 라링기 토니 무스 류기 라링 깨지시네 자오지지시네 진인버디 상주기 랑도 주야기 더시디 송고 딜라 여지디 송버리 다 여지디 더 유추주버리 여지스라 윤디간라 초사바 디바 종와 산질라 사단질라 도마진바 칸두 추종라 추바표 추바다 도마표 다 추바표 어디시드리스 다 디시디 간데스를 다 시자부 고에면도 간다 초사바 디제wen 신다수 하고도 초사바스라 윤디간라 빼나 나랑수 디온 되장 대풍바디 강길렘바리 Dunge Minduja, Dunge Chadr Bobadi, Kangi Lambers La Undigala, Di Dipon Gitu, Ro, Dio Casa, Dipopon, Geodu, Tindegi, Nyanlindi Yapu Majibe, Jinji, Jondu Sambe Tune, Dipon Gitu Chao Chicine, Sosaya, Dana Singi Dipopon Yaki, Touchigu, that Touchi, the Yakunjulu Chovapu, and Dana Singi. 下次啊，当过人多了，所谓流浪给给家伙的50钱，当然是民间票了，所谓的50钱呢，哎，那么工作了，所有的这些呢，50给家伙流浪给图呢，给家伙老不起多呢，你给家伙抵了点呢，叔叔让你男的要有呢，闹说，小要有呢，小说，让你掉的点吧，超掉的点吧的。 야와이나 초 디오드 뎀버슈 시시네 칸더 소사 지중 디버뻥 겨주비 저 가르제버 디타다 생긴了파모야당 랑진진 파 류동야다 랑진진 파 슈총도 동야기 진了파 동야 디 슈총도 동야기 털了파 상동야 어디는 잡지 차디고다 디버샤야데 다랑데 디다비군에 상동야레 산딜라 도모진야데 디다비군에 상동야레 디 된다 잡으라고지 시제인 주당디 어디레스 자연 주당디 되네라고지.
And then the next line reads, the fourfold practice is the most excellent method. So previously just talked about taking adverse conditions onto the path of enlightenment, but now this describes what practices more, well, directly or more specifically we should engage in. So what are these four practices? Well, the first practice is to accumulate merit, to accumulate positive potential or positive karma. Then the second is purifying negative karma, then making offerings to the malevolent forces, kind of harmful spirits, malevolent forces, and making offerings to the Dharma protectors. Now, these are the practices we should engage in. So what does that actually mean? In particular with accumulating merit, for instance. Now, we want to be happy. We don't want to suffer, but we continuously create the causes for suffering and destroy the causes for happiness, which is why we need to do it the other way around. We need to now overcome, that is purify, eliminate non-virtuous actions, and instead engage in virtuous actions. We have to make an effort towards this. So for this, we have to accumulate merit. It's important to accumulate positive karma, positive potential. And how can we do this? What are the practices we need to engage in order to be able to do that? Well, we can do, for instance, circumambulations, we can do prostrations, making offerings, and so forth. So there's so many prostrations, yeah, I mentioned those. So there's so many different practices we can engage in order to accumulate merit. And having done so, we should supplicate our lamas, we should supplicate the deities and kind of pray to them to say, well, if getting sick is better for me on a spiritual level, if it's better for me to get sick, so may I get sick. If it's better for me to die, well, then I shall die. If it's better for me to be happy for my spiritual practice, then please help me to be happy, and so forth. And in that way, whatever virtue we accumulate through the practices just described, well, we dedicate them for the benefit of all sentient beings. And we dedicate them to reduce our self-cherishing. In that way, we should engage in these four practices. So this is in terms of accumulating merit, purifying negative karma, and so forth. It's all quite similar in terms of supplicating our lamas, etc. in that way. So in that way, we should engage in these four practices as the most excellent method. Mr. Rinpoche.
Adine chelo kantu gundu jaras tati kunyenga shibido chechetu 단다랑 루부루부도 수수랑이라 나차요나 나차디 공라파 동야 공냥니 라파 주야 베차샤바이나 나차용바이나 오난 나차디 다 레잉이 비왕규용고레 뇨모비 왕규용고레 디인디간라 다 자오투서디 뇨모보다 투샤 디인디간라 뇨모비 자오다 차당 뇨모신기 자오 차당 디나니 자오 당진 딘데 투디고 다 단데네 거라 뇨모 공피 공도 피워지비 진주지 랑진진 차고 그래서 디제제디 매버수고도 산 디제를 준다 다야디 간더 둥엘레버 있는 둥에디 파 공냥을 파동야 디월레버 있는 디워디 공냥을 파동야 수수의 체체를 가르침의 참아 냥을 파 공냥을 두 파카주야디 체를 강투 공도 제르세 오디리.
Then it says, relate whatever you can to meditation right now, which means right now, whatever occurs in your life, utilize it for your practice. Make it part of your practice. For instance, when you get sick, well, when there's sickness, start practicing. Use this, make this part of your practice to think, well, whatever problem, such as the sickness, whatever problem arises, that is the result of karmic actions I've accumulated in the past, which in turn is the result of the different afflictive emotions that are part of my mental continuum. And they arise from attachment, which in turn has its root in the self-cherishing attitude, the self-centered attitudes, and self-grasping. And in that way, see that what is really responsible for this disease, understand what is the main cause, really understand this and understand its faults and how it gives rise to the sickness. Similarly, whatever arises in your life, whether it's suffering or not, reflect in that way. Even when happiness arises, well, reflect on it, make it part of your practice. Any experience right now related to the Dharma, make it part of your meditative practice.
디레 루종 된되미기 나로라 된 시바디 하나 된 숨바디 루사스바 된 시바레 나버리시레 다 지지기 냥니 시바 지지기 냥니 지네 템바 어디 시바디 이마다 디레 다 미지지기 냥니 참아 또가라 수 지지지네 또가이 나라 수 지지지네 냥니 제디 송고레 다 또가세디 또 당부디 다 또가를 디어다 지지기 냥니 참아 또가나 제기 또가 지당 치케미 고수 또가이 포 세진 도스 자그 말이 다 지지기 냥니 참아 또가를 집에 거라 또 당부디 핀베도 세디 뒤준도 니네 상주 망토지 파도 야나 뒤카오 지시 망통지 파도 상주지 세니 냥스 렘바당 나야 문제어 주지 냥도 나야 문제어 주지 메랑제다 나야 문제어 자우스 상주기 생량의 제다 나야 문제어 지기 상비 공농기 핀보당이들이 핀보타고 디 핀베도 오지.
That's it. And then the next is presentation of a lifetime's practice in summary. That is the next of the 7 point number 4. Here it says, in brief, the essence of instruction is this: apply yourself to the 5 powers. Now, what are these 5 powers? There are 5 powers set forth here with regard to living your ordinary life. And then there are the 5 powers with regard to the time of death. When you transfer, when your consciousness is, when there's this transference of consciousness taking place. So they're not explained in the same way. The 5 powers are when you're alive and at the moment of death. Now, the 5 powers when you're alive, like during your lifetime, the 5 of them, the first is the propelling intention, the power of the propelling intention, which really means it's an intention, a kind of intention that is such that you're determined not to give up the awakening mind. With regard to the 2 awakening minds, the 2 types of bodhicitta, conventional and ultimate, you're determined not to give them up. This is the power of the propelling intention.
아니버디 공배도 소야디 류강기 자오 류강 이송지 자오 가리 제버 이날에 진바당 시진땡 지시네 진바땡 지시네 단단 디제규에서 아니야 수수 가르치기도 시진기 잘하지시네 진시 땜베 토네 자오강 제장 자와장이 가르치기 위해서는 디제베 거라 상주기 세니지 냥린디 자와 창마다 자르치시네 냥린제디 쥐랑 탄지스는 자와 탄지지 거수 상주지 세 냥스 렘바다 민제와 제디 공배도리스.
Then the next power is the power of acquaintance, which means that no matter what activity you engage in, activity of body and speech in particular, well, based on mindfulness. So always be mindful. What are you doing? What are you doing in each moment? And based on that mindfulness, also of being aware of your action being positive or negative, acquaint yourself with bodhicitta. Always practice the awakening mind. Always practice the mind of enlightenment. Acquaint yourself with bodhicitta in all situations of your life based on that kind of mindfulness that was just described.
상주지 신 마지의 지워의 권의 공도 피의 체도 령아 이송지 군의 최상 공송지야最大的技术节我的各部사변지都是的是
Let's see. Then the next power is the power of positive seeds. So the power of positive seeds, which means that no matter when, so whatever you do with body, speech, and mind, well, you should first of all engage in the practice of listening and contemplating, and you should engage in the practice of accumulating merit. So whatever you do, accumulate merit in that way through listening and contemplating, and as well through accumulating merit in general. So this is what is referred to as the power of positive seeds, which in other words really refers to accumulating virtue.
Rani Jinzen Tang, Nyomoba Karachiba Inari, Langsang Pa Gachi, Rani Jinzile, you can all Kule Son Sanchi, Takuyabume, Ku Randa Shen Sam Ponchi Jukingi, Dundi Dabudire Sanchi, Pa Gachi, Shen Jinzen Luya Ji, what DJ Swinjimi Dose is.
Yes. The next power is the power of eradication, which means that whenever an affliction arises, whenever there's self-cherishing, just stop it right there. Become aware that this is the real monster. This is what really harms me. So what harms me, what causes me all this trouble is self-cherishing and all the other afflictive emotions, to make an effort to stop them. So to overcome them, to weaken them, to lessen them. That is the power of eradication.
Ngaba di melangi to di susugi gijur kare cheba inar giju chebe njudila ge zawon dila tene nangada nebe sinje tangje sanje ji goban tin de di goban to be juru juji sambata ge zawon dila tene dani ji shangju ji sen namba ni nyang sen ya da minje wo juji sang tinde gi melange di melangi to.
Yes. Then the fifth power is the power of aspirational prayers, to pray that whatever virtue you accumulate, to pray that may this become a cause for all sentient beings to be enlightened. May I never be separated from the two types of bodhicitta. That we call the power, or that is described as the power of aspirational prayers.
Di wodila chikemi gosu. Da susu shidoji di gang chikemi gosu. Poa nang la po chu du ju di do nga nyang ling jie di sta di chike mi go ji do ni ngai nyang ling di kare long ni ga dang bu di re da ga bu sa bian ji dou sui da ga bu sa bian ji dou sui da su su ran ni chi re ji di ga ran la yue be jun de long xue mo bu kan de ji yue be di chang ma lu cha xin bu zang me be tu ni sen jin xin le yin ba dan lama sang jie le pu kare jie gu yue na chang ma pa lu dang ne rangi ngubudi tsama lu dang ji ne xin la pa ya pyu ya da jimba dong ya da da gar jie ba yin re ge shu la pa dong ya di ga bu sa bian ji dou res.
Yes. And then the next two lines, as Mahayana's transference method is the 5 powers alone, the practice is vital. What does it say here? It describes these 5 powers at the time of the transference of consciousness, at the time of death. Here, the order of the 5 powers is slightly different. The first power in this case is the power of positive seeds. So what you do is you give all your belongings, whatever belongs to you, you offer it without attachment, without holding on to them. Instead, you offer them to sentient beings, you offer them to the 3 jewels, to the lamas, and so forth. So letting go you offer them, and in that way transform them into something positive, into something virtuous. Kind of engage in that virtuous practice.
No, that melangi to di kare long la ta chige mi go su sang dang ni rangi du song de sa ge zai tu le den ne su su ran ni jiao ni ci le tan jie du xiang ju ji sen nyang si len ba da min de wo ju ji xiang ju ji sen nyang si len ba da min de wo xiang ju ji sen nyang si len di ma jie ba xie xi ne du da de nyang si len yu bo shu nyang si len ne xiang ju ji sen gong ne gong de pi wo shu jiao ni ci le tan jie de
And so likewise, at the time of death, what you should, the next power you should generate is the power of aspiration of prayers, which basically means to pray to encounter the teachings on bodhicitta in the next life. So may I be able to encounter these teachings, may I be able to continuously meditate on the mind of enlightenment, on bodhicitta, may I be able to enhance this mind, and may I never be separated from Buddhas and Bodhisattvas that teach me in order to attain the enlightenment of a Buddha. Excuse me. So in that way, at the time of death, you apply the power of aspiration of prayers. Yes.
Dine chike mi go su yang o da nga shi de ji du da nga ji su bu ma di wo cha mi yo chike mi go su gang yan che mi yo sang din de gi ji nang du dang sin de din de le ba yin na o da din de gi sin de le cha ma lu tu sa cha ma lu ran ni lü da ma tu xi ran ni jin jin ran ni lü da ma tu be ran le xin cha ji de dang ran ni jin jin gi lu chu chu je ba re din de ga na da ne song ding e ran ni jin jin da ran le xin cha de du cha ma never switch ni nana ya na ju xin ya xi yo su xi ni din de sang dong gi yin sang be tu ne qi ge mi go su rang le xin jia jie de nga xin de kar jie yong sang ji da jie di jie de pa gang gu jie di xun jin be dou qia wo de si.
Yes. Then at the time of death, the next power you should focus on is the power of eradication. In that, well, if you worry, for instance, well, when I'm dying, or when the hour of my own death draws closer, I may have pain, there may be fear and so forth. Instead, to feel, never mind, whatever is going to come, it doesn't matter. It's because of my self-centeredness. Therefore, no matter whether I have fear or there be pain or not, and I feel sick, etc., whatever happens, happens. It doesn't matter. But instead, to aspire to overcome this self-centeredness that causes all those. That is the power of eradication, that you should generate at the time of death.
Da dine chike mi go su 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 gi dang jia xia ji ni. Da chike mi go su dan da nga chi de yu chi da ge ji ni ba du zhe tong du ji na xin du re chi kam ni go su yang ni xiang ju ge sen nyang len jie da min zhe wo ji yin da na xin ba du le le ba yin re ji wo gan zhe ji le le ba yin re xiang ju ji sen nyang len ji jie da min zhe wo ji yin hang bi dang jie da bu xia ye de le pin bei dou shi re si min zhe wo ji jie gu du sang di jie tu wo ji yin sang de pin bei dou xie da din de gi pin bei dou yue bei tu ne chi ke mi go su da su su xi de jie di gang la nian zu message nian dang message cha yu yo di di go su yang xiang ju ge sen ni gong ji ji ne xiang ju ge sen gong da na xin da me be dao gong ya gong ba di da di gong bei dou cha di go re na yang xiang ju ge sen nyang ne de men zhe ji yin sang ba dang jie da bu xia ye de pin bei dou cha go ro.
Yes. And then the last two powers are the power of propelling intention and the power of acquaintance. Now, the power of propelling intention is kind of like you make the promise. You're determined. You generate this kind of this mental determination. I will definitely recall bodhicitta. So when I'm dying, when I'm in the intermediate state, the pardo and so forth, during that time, I will definitely recall this mind of enlightenment. So that's the kind of propelling intention, to generate this type of intention. And then based on that intention, there's the power of acquaintance, where you actually engage in the practice of uninterruptedly training in bodhicitta, in selflessness and so forth.
Lojong be ce ten ba se di da lojong gi nyang len jie ne lojong gi nyang len be ce du chu ce long be da kar yor si na chu gen gong bo ji dun du is 다 상제 존인데기 송비 취탕지 당진 뒤에 토스 송바다 랑 진진 뒤에 토스 송바지 구송나 다 룬종비 체지디레스 다 체니바디 방분이지 조송세 방분이지 조송세디 미신다기 참 추바 야부레샤 세기 딘데기지 방부순의 제 디지부긴 되기매봐 수수기 상로디 수수로 고도 마주인데 수수기 때네 오 취의 템이 나는 다다지 렌도민도 디테지니 취의 템버지 상제기 손의 템버지 중요나 시임 간사 신기 방부다 라니기 방부 니가 된시시네 아니 방부 니가 창소나 룬종비 다지리스 다 디자인의 마세비 다 손바디 룬종비 체 손바디 이딘 바시 진의 띵세 다 진 장부의 체바이나야 심바 마추바시지 신 디원이야도야 진 님바의 체소나야 심바 마추바시지네 신 시원이야도야 너나 장닝기 진 칸데 샤나야 심바를 주도 자원이 매버지 심바베 효시기 딜하랑 지지네 데토야지 심바지부지 데토에 좀이나 디양 룬종베 체지리스 디장의 마스 인장 토는 장바인세 인장 토는 장바인 송야디 디스이월 베차 차츠연바이나 루종기 나는 체치지네 베 루종기 나는 타르신바지 차베 거라 간데 용거스라운디가 진 간데지 티바인 베나 미신다기 치두자 간데지 러바인데 오네진 치두자 러디 가서 파 콘두랑고로 시당 루당치나 다 치두자 러버디 콘두롱야기 줄런드에 파샤 치두자 러야디 수수기 냥내 공도 피하기 진을 판두되지 르라 나차다 강에 간데지 좀바이나리 디 수수 심바 마지바 차야다 냥내 슈총르드에 진런드에 파샤 디 당도 냥내 지에기 진을 파 진도 판 준주에지 차송나 오다 루야부 종 루종기 냥내 셀롱바지의 타르신비 다리스 루종비.
Now, number 5 is the presentation of the measure of having trained the mind. So fast as the intent of all teachings converges on a single point. So being aware that the scriptures and treatises, whatever was taught, all the texts, they were taught for the purpose of overcoming self-grasping, self-centeredness. So that's one aspect that in this case we become aware of. And then what we should do, if we do this, so one measure of having trained the mind is of the two witnesses uphold the principal one. So the two witnesses are other people, the external world, like other people, kind of observing our own progress, and ourself being a witness to our own progress. So of the two, being our own witness is it's what we should rely upon. We should not rely upon what other people think, how far we've gotten with regard to our own practice, but of these two witnesses, we should uphold our own, being our own witness to our progress. And then it says, cultivate constantly the joyful mind alone. So another measure of having trained the mind is that, yeah, of course, when things are going the way we want them to go, when they're a conducive condition to our practice, we feel joyful. But we should also feel joyful when there are adverse conditions. So no matter what happens, our mind remains joyful. Our mind remains happy and content. So this is another measure of having trained the mind. And then lastly, if this can be done even when distracted, you're trained. For instance, if there's a situation when someone insults you, when someone hurts your feelings and insults you, well, ordinarily the response is to get angry. That would be the response. But instead of that, to turn this around, to make this insult, to turn this insult, to utilize it as your practice, to turn it around, to utilize it in your everyday kind of practice, that would be number 4. If this can be done even when distracted by this insult, for instance, you are trained. So if you can do all these 4 aspects, if you could do this effectively, then that's the measure of having trained your mind.
수들기 동바다 상주스미 동 상하기 동바디수 남에다 동시티 동바당 개위 쥐바디 가shum마시 제디 미제바지 다야 투주로 미쇼세디 루종기 냥린 제규에스제네 아니 담마다치로 가르지 또버 통보 인도도 제진에 가중마중 제디에디 상제기 꾸려야 지메다고 제디야 신진 지 신라양 남의 동대에 수리 내 제디에디 지금 말에스 디니버디 투주로 미시 모셔오세디 숨바디 슈리 마노세디 안더 미카셰지를 핀도주에 치드 미신다 카실을 뉴버제야 밀을 뉴버 밀을 핀도주에 치도 양화的路사다다 디주제디라 변 별라 있는 디어를 롱버리라 율라세지어로 딘데 요레 디주제디라 간더 지 밀을 핀도주에 치도 지신 낭세 변 낭세 순제 이너리 낭세 가중마중 장글 요로 낭세 가중마중 또 딘데제는 리오 마레스 지상 카셰라 핀 카셰라 뉴제야 딘데지미로 마레스 디지den수
And then the sixth point, or point number 6, is the presentation of the commitments of mind training. So train constantly in the 3 general points. The 3 general points are as follows. First, you should train your mind to not contradict your pledges and vows. So vows such as the Pratimoksha vow, the Bodhisattva vow, and so forth. You shouldn't kind of act in contradiction to the vows you've taken. The second is you should discard objectionable behavior, any kind of harmful behavior. So feeling I'm engaging in mind training, so to generate arrogance because of that, and no longer to no longer respect Buddhas or Buddha images, or to not to kind of ignore sentient beings. None of those behaviors, these behaviors should be discarded. These objectionable, harmful behaviors should be discarded. And the third general point is that your mind should not be biased, should not be partial, in that you shouldn't help some, but harm others in that context. So to kind of prefer some sentient beings and to neglect others. This shouldn't happen. For instance, in some areas of Tibet, for instance, there are certain local celestial, local deities or local kind of spiritual being or spirit beings. We shouldn't harm them. We shouldn't benefit humans at the expense of these local deities, for instance, or in other cases, kind of destroy something, kind of destroy some aspect to benefit others, etc. So it's important to have no bias, to not be partial to some sentient beings and neglect others in that process.
That you would do Rangsu Shasedi, Sang Jordans, Shigi Dulu Grandanda, Jubatizu, Nanimba in season, you do get Tango Ranja days, the Pensichiri. That Lojong Tangsi, the Lojong Nanijing in the Chegusung. The inland number Jumishas Lonigala, that Gansa Shengi Jen Judy la Gansa Pena, Midi Yabun Dudi, Inaya, Mishara says. Midi Yabun Dudi, Ya, with Sansan could do Jachi to say, Jidan Yabun Dudi, any Chashe Kashi, Inla Kashi Tundus, Dunjin, and Jen to say, Dinner Inla Ritsu, Jujis in the Junji de Magis, Dianji Randangi to Shinla, New Sing Guninland. Danashi. Lojong Dansila, Shinsho Kayami Sam. This is what Sinjin Shin la Juan Gari Tumba in the Re, Juanji Tong Digan or Juan di Kuran la Yuene, Juan Tong di Yimbi Niba Mever, Juan Tonya di Sinjin Juan Tongsegi Sinjin di Juan Yimba Mangiba, Susu Rani, Ran la Juan Yu Zani Rangi Mishin la Juan Tong Yores, Juan Tonya di Shin la Juan Tonya di Shingi Juan Miba, Rangi Juan la Bayaki. Shin la Juan Tonya Tsamo Rangi Juan Dai di Diridayang, Shin la Juan Yuba di Juan Maris Sijin la Yu Mari, Nanjun Arasu Game Gumela, Nando Mabu Sijine, Juan Yume Hamagubi Tuni Juan Tong de Chindo, Sanlu Kajun Majun, Pindu Medibi, Mila Juan Tong de Tisujeti Zosung Yore. Dayang Susuki Sengi Nangula, Nyomo, Shu Chuchun Kari Yuba in the Ringela, Shu Chunwadilla, Kadejane, Nyanin Sunda Maiba. Nyomo Karichio in the Dilla Katijaburis, the Lojong Tansiris. Dayang, Jebi Tanji Pansage. Nasu Lojong in Yanichi, oh, Jimangala, Jebu Yabuchi Tochini, 게다 야부지 용지시네 아니 가 야부차 그래 상상순다 최량의 제디 몽벌라 지 당년다당 딘제기 제부 용액이 제와 제비 투네 최량의 제디 제주어마디 방구레스 디제.
Yes. And then it goes on to say, transform your attitudes, but remain as you are. So Buddhist practice, mind training is about changing the mind, not your outer appearance, for instance. So be natural, remain who you are. You don't need to dress in a certain way and so that others may think you look very spiritual or have you. So your outer appearance doesn't have to change. Remain who you are, but transform your mind. That is another commitment of mind training. Then it says, do not speak of the defects of others, in the sense that, well, we may say, yeah, this person is really nice, but, and then go on to say that they're not very friendly, that they're not very, that their actions are not very positive and so forth. So we may criticize this person, but this means criticism for one's own benefit. So out of a self-centered kind of attitude to speak of the defects of others. So kind of maybe even praising them, but to also point out their faults. That was another commitment. And do not reflect on others' shortcomings. And here, that doesn't mean to kind of apply or engage in constructive criticism. That's not what this is about. But it's like seeing a fault, criticizing for a fault that we ourselves actually have, some fault that we ourselves have, and then kind of criticizing others for having this same fault. That would be a case of reflecting on others' shortcomings. So it needs to be explain what that actually refers to. And again, we should not engage in that kind of reflection on other shortcomings. Then the next commitment is to work on our greatest delusion first. So of our different delusions, our different afflictive emotions, we shouldn't start with the weakest one, but we should choose the strongest one, the one that is the strongest in our mental continuum, and start to train to overcome that. And then the next is discard all expectations of reward. So instead of hoping that if I engage in this activity, then I will be famous, I'll be renowned, I'll get a lot of wealth, I'll be respected and so forth. Well, discard all expectations of that kind of reward.
Tadi odila dujinji sebang sediri di rang la cha shen dang rani jinzen gi wang gi ge jiao jie ina di nyomo be lebe ge jiao cha go de de ma jes xiong sang bu ma den se di duan da di da mi xin da gi nyoba ji jie ina ku nga lo nyoba jie song sang ji kwen zen jie shu sen na di nyoba jie de sen la ka du ina nya de ji ni da ku nga lo nyoba jie song sang 가duğ인 마제버지 센나 베드 냥지 니마지 녀쿨로 린루고상 근데 마제스 샹이 마괴세디 수르 나란술라 치랑 빵구리 두자레스 지러버이나 팔렌티라야 치랑야 빵구리 두자레스 린 님벌루야티 마제버지 수르 두자라냐 팔오 쿨로 연된 주시시니 쿨로 άμ버 주버이 제딘데 제투고레스 다 참망구세디 디시고레 미지기 수수로 녀버제버이나 다디 녀버디 센나 샤네 다기 공로 쉬버나시 큰진제 장망시 당에 국가 구지시네 미신다디라 강년 친부지 제베거라 년쿨로 린루고상 쿨로 녀버제기 국가디 가두라기도 되네 구데디 마지스 디스고.
Yes, shit. Then the next commitment is to discard poisonous food, which means we should not engage in virtuous activity. I mean, engaging in something that is considered to be virtuous, that is actually motivated by attachment to the I, attachment to the self, so a form of self-centeredness. We shouldn't engage in activities when we're mainly motivated but with attachment to the self. Then the next commitment is do not maintain inappropriate loyalty, which means to be loyal in the sense like when you're being insulted, for instance. So to hold on to this, to hold a grudge, we should not hold a grudge. So this is an inappropriate loyalty to like holding this grudge. We shouldn't do that, to hold on to it. We should let it go. And then the next commitment is do not torment with malicious banter. So for instance, if someone insults us, when someone kind of says something that hurts us, well, instead of retaliating, like saying, well, you are also like that, instead, we shouldn't do that. but rather make an effort to actually point out a good quality in that person. Instead, you point out a quality that a good quality that they have. And then the next is do not lie in ambush. So that means that we should not hold a grudge. We should not harbor vengeance in the same way as before, but not just should we not hold a grudge for a wrong that is done to us, for an insult and so forth. We should not wait to retaliate. So in like, kind of we hold this grudge, we harbor vengeance and then wait to get back at that person. We shouldn't do that. So that's what it means, do not lie in ambush.
Sa dine ne la meo slong di gang la mi xin da la be juan qi xu di mi xin da di la ji pu du qi xu ru ya gi juan gar du de ne juan di chu lu duan qi xi ne mi xin da la ma bu le le de shuo wo di ma ji is in di song ta ni ba di zu ke lang lo mi ju se di si wo rang gi jiao no chi ji jie ji xi ne 내가 노트지 제요이나 랑기 노트지 겐디 수수키고로 디 수수 마키we지네 노트 수수제 디긴 겐디 미신가 신다강을 봐 요야들이 노트 수수제 겐디 미신다강을 봐 요야디 마지스 조지 찌미되 세디 디시오다 추바 로종기 냥린지 카시 요이나 오 로종기 냥린지 카시엔도 디나로라 나라랑 로종기 냥린지 킨 야슈디레 세기 게다 용야디 제고 수수 야슈레 세기 잡아디 게다디 투바치고도 상상 디마제스 돌로미자 세디 디스고다 루종기 나니 제야디 취지고래 밀러 펜비치 지고래 타바다 탄제진비 고만 투비치 지고래 마도베 루종기 나니 제야디 신딜라 나자메요야다 신딜라 수수의 쟁임바 마체야다 다나신 신딜라 수수의 미신다기지 치 두자了呀나捐节的马用一个捐到了节呢他底下吧的是去古路多路下过的是这道路吧送出去我底解决嘛的是记得但他对的没有谁的地路上两年节的牛毛没有谁个节都路上两年节过的这的路上两年节有些呢俺节去庆祝的他对的二吧的是的公呀他公过的捐了对累用的是对累用过的是다 제지인라 두마수세 디스고레 다 된다딘 디리 수수라니로 기본되기 체도 미신다了变呢 나라 기부용 쿠시소나 나라 야부지 용사레서 쿠나자나나 나라 야부지 용사레서 상로 님버딘데 담베이나 라니 디부용기 체도 미신다了지 나자지 용로제나 자미시버지 용로제나 두자지 용로제나서 두자 용에디 출마데스 디따마데스 어디 루종기 당시 디주제들이다.
And then it says, well, do not strike at the heart, which means, well, we shouldn't act in such a way that we kind of examine what would hurt this other person the most and then offend this other person by way of, well, kind of saying these things about this person, saying them to others and hurting them in such a way. So we shouldn't strike at the heart in that way. And then he goes on to say, do not place the load of a zo onto an ox. So certain animals, so do not place them onto an ox, which really means if we have made a mistake, if we personally made a mistake, we have to take responsibility. We need to live up to our mistake and not shift the blame onto others. Therefore, we should take personal responsibility for what we've done and not blame others for our mistakes. So that is to not place the load of a zo onto an ox. We should avoid that. Do not sprint to win a race means, well, when we engage in mind training, we shouldn't be competitive about it in the sense that we hope to be famous, we hope to be well known now and want to be the best kind of person in terms of being the best mind trainer and so forth. So we shouldn't have that kind of attitude and therefore so not sprint to win a race. And then the next commitment is do not abuse this practice as a right, or Rinpoche says for the wrong purpose, for the wrong attitude. It could also be translated in that way, which means we engage in this practice in order to overcome self-grasping, self-cherishing, and in order to become a Buddha, not for other reasons. Again, We should not engage in this practice in order to be happy in this life, to not get sick, in order for other people to like us and not to be criticized, etc. It should really purely be done for the sake of, eventually Buddhahood. And then it says, do not turn the gods into demons, which would be like becoming inflated by our practice of mind training. So that would be like, instead of making it something celestial, turning into something superior, we turn it into a demon. Therefore, don't become inflated by the practice of mind training. And lastly, do not seek misery as a means to happiness, which means we should not draw personal gratification from others' miseries. We shouldn't hope that another person may die or get sick or have any other kind of problem, hoping that this will benefit us. So in this way, we should not seek the misery of others as a means to our personal happiness.
가리 냥니 제구레 송디가나 담부 년주 단체 지기자 다 가르치고 있는 저 가르치고 있는 내가 가르치고 있는 상을 가르담고 있는 제제 참마 상세 참마 통세 참마 편배 상배 왕기 인을 편배 상보다 문제위 토네 인을 편배 상보다 문제위 년주기 냥니 주어로 냥니 뒤집이 토네 유체 디군이 제고레스 이 년주 단지 지기자스 로년 단지 지기자스 라윤디강나다 장라 로종기 나니 제바 있나레 마제바 있나 간다 장라 가리 좀바 있나레 로종기 나니 제베 걸라 나와 차와 징이 괴차 미신다기 되라동야 양면의 두자라야 다나시 미마기 뉘바 생기 랑기 생주지 너무 슈치르에 슈총을 만들어지 슈치르에 된데 라수바 가르 용바 이너리티 장라 민디어바 가르 용바 이너리티 용베 거라 오 당알라 민디어바 디 종송 신진 신라야 민디어바 디다부 유킨 장len 데바 쉬어레 신진 디다 탄제지 민디어바 탄제 랑기 민디어바 디 띵도 디버슈 디 구체버슈 디기 띵도 신진 탄제기 민디어바 디 띵도 종지지네 신진 신 탄제 민디어바 지장 매버슈 지 민디어바 지장 마체버슈 시지네 다진냥지 냥니 디지부치고 그래스 로네 탄제 지기자스 참마 다진냥지군이 상단이 강에 체비 걸스 거다 강에 가르치네야 다진냥지기 냥니 지부토네 파동네 제슈스 토다니의 자원이슬랑디가라 슈방아부 야 랑베거라 오 땅에 다리 상주기 신 냥슬렘보다 문제와 제기 탐베 토네 공농기 핀바당 답디 투마제 디제 타마제세디 공다마 네갈라마디 상단이 오 다리에 제베 나로라 상주기 신 냥슬렘보다 미팀바 가르친도 팀바 가르친도 상단이 로종기 당지의 팀바 가르친도 미팀바 가르친 상단이 미팀바 제베 디제 장가지네 아니 미팀바 mambu제 요베이나 딜라 수수라 디제네 다 칸라스라 고래 오다 창지미도 다 나주이제셔스 수수로 전주지 다 창마 팀바 제요베이나 가와 공네 공민라 야부치 디 투더니라 자원이 세트.
Yes. And then as to the presentation of the precepts of mind training, so that kind of explains how we should go about mind training, how we should practice it. Well, the first one is accomplish all yogas through single means, which means that whatever activity we engage in, whatever we think about, whatever we see, whatever we perceive, we should never be separated from the wish to benefit others, from the mind that is dedicated towards the benefit of, towards the welfare of all sentient beings. So with this kind of attitude, wanting to benefit others, no matter what we do, we should never be separated from that. And then he goes on to say, overcome all errors through a single means, which means like, well, whether we engage in mind training or not, well, whatever happens to us, whatever, especially whatever unwanted suffering arises, whether we're cold or sick, whether we're criticized, anything that happens to us that we actually don't want, we should remember, we should recall that all sentient beings experience such that, well, in a greater measure, actually, much stronger, much worse than we do, and think that may all this ripen on us, may all these problems ripen on us and not on other sentient beings, may they be free from this. So this would be to overcome all errors through a single means. And the next is there are two tasks, one at the start and one at the end. So the one at the start, it refers to the first thing in the morning, just after we woke up. It's important to generate the right kind of motivation, to start off with generating the appropriate motivation. And then in the end of the day, we should reflect on our day. Did I act according to the Dharma or in contradiction to the Dharma? And reflect on that. And if we find that we've acted in contradiction with the Dharma, to be kind of critical with regard to ourselves, to kind of admonish that, like to think that this was wrong, this was not appropriate. And if we find we've acted in accordance with the Dharma, to rejoice in those virtuous actions.
다랑라 신도 동해와 냥타바 까냐 가수 정보 있는 오 수수라니기 칭하미기 랭이 사빈 제보다 미신라 뉴버제빈 제보다 랑기 만지버 지빈 제보레 상치시네 만지비 주 디바 봉야기 더시치 다랑라 핀송수버 시부주 용디강의 양 밤에라 마당버 지시네 랑라 핀송수버 종어디다 탐지 주기월의 뒤에 종요의 상치시네 랑의 평소수 종어디 계쇼라 파 동야디 제고레스 디 니부 강신 즈버자세 가르 종내양 즈버지단 딘데치 제토고레스 다 니부소다 뒤에 송세디 디레 니부세디 니디 상제기 취지 러자 베는 수더기 동바당 상주스메 동 상하기 동베 당지요로 디 취지 당지세 다 하버도 그인데 로종기 당시 디니니부디 소다 뒤니 수수 소낭신 제신이 송그레스 다 가오송 러버 자송에디 가오송디 가레스는 시당 나조 참만의 깔레 가부디 녀모 당부집에 걸라 녀모디 무마시베 제신이 무시버 가와 녀모 줄지네 디 두버 가와 바도 두버 가와 타마디 녀모 줄지네 녀모베 준 녀모베 뉴바디 파 창제 제신이 사르 녀모보 미지버제디 할레베 깔레 가보리 다디 깔레 가부 디송부디라 동니지시니 가오송디 러스나 다 당부 녀모지디가나 지마타도 녀모 문신버제 문신 토야기 털러서 바르도 님부티네 녀모 도베 털러서 타르 녀모 땡도 봉이 털러서 고레스 어디 가오송라 서버제세티
Then forbear whichever of the two arises. Now, even if there's great suffering, even if we have experienced a lot of problems in our life, we should always reflect on the fact that, well, this is because of non-virtue accumulated in the past. So without getting demoralized and so forth, work on avoiding now any kind of causes that could lead to future suffering. And then in the case that, well, for not everything goes well for us and we don't have problems, again, without becoming too attached and so forth, instead, we should acknowledge this and make an effort to continuously accumulate virtue, which is the actual cause of such pleasant experience. And then guard the two, even at the cost of your life, which means, well, the two are here, the general precepts and commitments as presented by the Buddha in the scriptures. And then the more specific kind of commitment is the one of mind training. Now we should keep our Pratimoksha vow, for instance, the Bodhisattva vow, etc. We shouldn't go, we shouldn't contradict these, and keep the commitments of mind training. Then it says train in the three difficult challenges. So there are three things that are difficult to do. First of all, recognizing our delusions, recognizing our anger, aversion, and so forth, our attachments, etc. And then secondly, so we need to first work on recognizing our afflictive emotions. Secondly, we need to temporarily pacify them. And lastly, eradicate their continuum by applying the antidote. So in that way, first, work on, however difficult it may be, but to make an effort to recognize the different kind of afflictions, the different kind of delusions, then make an effort to temporarily pacify them, and eventually completely overcome them. Those are the three difficult challenges, and we should train in those.
Lama Sambu, Rangi Chu, Nyanin Tsujin the Cheba, Chu Drubi Tunjin, Segulo Suban Zomba, Dison Tire, Dison de Ranlan Zona, Gawagon, Sinjin Shenla, Dison Matsawa, Manzomba Tonsona, Sinjin Shenla Yang, Dison Tower Shoes, Melanda, Shenla Dison Town, Yohag Chedu, Melanda Zanda Masebe, DW, Jin, Juju Soma Sambis, Sinjin Shenla Mini, Niji Goya. Or Dizute, Dichegures.
Quando si di niba da summa yanke sono ci. Niba da summa ni di. Da di summa ci.
Rani cheba.
Tamu ji gyoshin ji la ra, gyoshin da den gwa.
Niba di rani gi chu nyani tsujin de cheba.
Ale.
Sumba di chu dube tunjin se dang gui dang nemen le suban zomba.
No so. No sé. And then the next is adopt the three principal conditions. So we need to make an effort, need to as much as we can, to get together to kind of accumulate these three principal conditions. One is a spiritual teacher, as a qualified Lama. The next is to practice the Dharma appropriately in the right way, to really practice in accordance with the teachings. And the third is to make an effort to gather the conducive conditions for Dharma practice. So such as whatever clothing we need, whatever food we need in order to be able to practice effectively. We should work on those three principal conditions: the spiritual teacher, one's own practice, and the conducive conditions for one's practice. And if we find we have accumulated them, well, let's rejoice in that fact. And if we find we haven't accumulated them, then to make an effort to accumulating them, but also to generate the wish for all sentient beings. May all sentient beings generate these three conditions and be successful in that, and rejoice in the fact that at some point they will accumulate these three conditions or generate these conditions. That is, yeah.
Dine nyamba meba nangsung gong song nyamba meba song di lama dang sangje la meba da guishe nyamba meba. Lojong gi chu nyangsen lemba la zhuo gaju nyamba meba. Dumba song gi loja dangzi song nyamba meba. O di song la fa gu res. Da dine deme song de dembar sha se di lunga yi song chi dipa pang lunga yi song chi ge zao song zhu chi chi ne di da min zhawa chi gu res.
Yes. And then the next point or the next aspect is contemplate the three that are free of degeneration, which means, well, first of all, we should make an effort to have undiminished respect for and faith in our Lama and in the Buddhas, the Dharma, and so forth. Secondly, we should engage in mind training with joy and a liking of those. So we should generate joy and happiness to engage in practice. And lastly is we should be mindful and through mindfulness keep the pledges of mind training. Then the next aspect is be endowed with the three inseparable factors. The three inseparable factors are performing virtues of body, speech, and mind.
Yulo shume dadu jang, chao de dingyong gong le ji songya di, da lujong gi nyangni je di gang la ni ji gongba yinare, da na shingi zuba gongba yinare di, yu shuri wa zang ma yinba, kashe la zuba gong, kashe la mi gongba tinde ma yinba. Tsama la gong yaji. Din di gang la, tsama la mi di gonggu di gang la, mi tada dang, min zang ma se, mi da mi ma yinba, la suba, tsama la mi ne, tsama la chaba, senje tanje la chaba ji gu res. Senje tanje la mi ne gongba zang da ma se, di yang, ka zang si zang ma yinba, sen di ne, senji tingi ni gongo res tinjong gon la di senji gon la tinge ji de che go res ta ko na la da do gong se di ku lo se di dire ben senjing ge na lo la nga zu na jun ka she la nga zu ta du jun de di de le do mi ka she la mi ni ji gong tu mi do mi ka she la mi ni zu ba gong tu ya mi do ku pe do ja re she se nga zu na jun ni ji gong 카부 유에기 생진 디조당 다나신 수수기 다당 수수라 따버리시 녀버제 댕이 딘데기 랑르 뒤디 샹버드 지워 공가스기 생진 디달라 미니 하버도 샹버 공구레 지워 공구레 디달라 미니 루종 공구레스 디송고.
Yes. And then it goes, the next two lines are, train constantly towards the chosen object. It is essential that the training is deep and all-pervasive. That means that, again, we should make an effort, whether we generate compassion or patience, forbearance, whatever it is, we should not be partial towards anyone, but instead our practice should encompass all sentient beings. In that way, therefore, should be all pervasive. It should be all pervasive, and we shouldn't leave out anyone. And it should come from deep within. So from the depth of our heart, from deep within. Therefore, all pervasive, our practice should be all pervasive, coming from the depth of our heart. And then it says, always meditate on what has been set apart, which means oftentimes people ask, well, yeah, I'd like to practice compassion and so forth, but it's so difficult to generate compassion for certain beings if they're specifically obnoxious and rude, etc. So it's so difficult to be patient with them. It's so difficult to have compassion for them. But here in this case, we should generate specifically. So if there's someone who's really obnoxious or an enemy, an adversary, whoever it is, if we have a hard time with them, we should make an effort specifically to kind of set them apart and generate a specific love and compassion for them, especially for them.
Yeah, 今天打了对没下死，春节总别个了，几部月别个了，陆兄给娘人起因。 갈래 체베 걸라 지금이 상바 디야 제주어 말이스 디네 다리 조 냥스랑 세디 단란 가랑수 밀리투베 걸라 지 년가 조디 냥린 조디 제체디 신디레 심마 주치월에 심이 된지 심하게 나니자 코에 디월레제 탑에 디월 개치그레 동해기 자오 녀모밤베 디워디 개치그레 탑에 디워 된지 랑된레 신된 개치그레 신경 조치 제자 년가 조디제제디 냥린제 당디 토버제는 배구레스 다 굴로미샤세디 니지모요레 굴로세시당 굴로 주송요레디 비제나로로 요레 이내 조디스요레 나라수 미카시 자오 잠부제라 자오니 미즈여바지 깔레카네 아게 제도민도스파 유야지 자오 님바제디가라 깔레자니 카야메바지 딜라 자오 굴로세디로 Zuba Kulu Chati Majis, Tindegi Kulu Tedi Majis.
Yes, yes. And then it says, do not depend on other conditions. So oftentimes it's like when everything is going well, when conducive conditions come together, we feel we want to practice the Dharma, we want to engage in mind training. But as soon as there's a problem, we give up. So we should not depend on other conditions in that sense, to depend on outer conducive conditions. Then it says, engage in the principal practices right now. So what is really important of this life? What is most important, the well-being of this life or future lives? No, it's future lives. What is most important, the happiness of samsara or the happiness of nirvana? It's the happiness of nirvana. What is most important, our own benefit or the benefit of others? It's others. So in that way, we should really check if there is an option between two, which one of the two is more important, which is the principal aspect, and then practice accordingly. And then the next line says, do not apply misplaced understanding, which is really beautiful, Rinpoche says. There are actually 6 types of them. But just for the sake of explaining it, well, we should, for instance, one of those 6 is misplaced forbearance or misplaced patience. Oftentimes, we don't have the forbearance to engage in virtuous practice. Oh, it's so difficult. I can't do it. It's so hard. I don't want to do it. So if it's something virtuous and positive, we don't have the patience to engage in it. But if it's something negative, something harmful, we're totally motivated. So therefore, it's important to not apply this misplaced understanding in the form of the forbearance from which you just explained.
rinjo mija sayadi disgore dari jiyu bisumchi dari nyani jiyu bisum yang sani jiyu me bisumchi dinje gibi jela majela sunde dinje jeju yo mare lujong gi nyani da pinsin ji lujong da jedi be zi ji du dari jeba na shi sani yang ji mu tuni ji gure da yang duche de jang sayadi ji dari yang ji sani yang ji di zang ma yin ba ji jun dun jie ya gi ji 제구 낭송 제구순의 장마인바 디베 타르신바지 탈라마토기 봐도 뉴바만 행바도 제구레스 뒤죄의 장스 다 도죄니지 타와자세 디스고다 도주 죄바세디 수수기 생라 다제지니 다 생라 다제지니 뉴몬 디지기도 당생 디지기도 나젠 딘데지기도 세지네 수수기 생라 다제지니 뉴모 가르지 유에메다 뉴모 집에 유티 수제디 간데간데 렌도 도주 죄바스나 신주지니 제바제지니 제바제지니 다 랑진진다 당진다 뇨모지워티다 무인심버 제지니 다 디다기 님부딘 디다기 님부딘 제지니 디다레 타와치지 디다 도버제디 도주니지 타와차스 다 유망공세디 니지문도 다 밀러 펜베 자와지 펜베 상보디 공디강라 나야 녜체랑의 펜베 상보 공부인다 녜체랑의 야부체인다 시지 유시에 지오로파 유시에 디마지스 디핑이 말이스 다 고노미 동세디 디레 미망부 예색지라 수수라니라 미신다기 준주 제바이나 로 수수기 심바 충주에당 딘데 용디고로 다나신 수수당 단단냐냐 예데바 베나 수수레 토마 수수레자 조제 수수레 마오제 지라 쿠야 친구차지니 수수레 야오 친구시부 차윤디가 생기 나로 미즈여 제조로 어디마지스 세상 디제디간라 고노마동세디 타도마지에세 고노스는 타도레 어디레 다 유장버 미자세디 디레 디야니지무도 미기 때라동디간라 가추추제 미기 메라당디간라 두추추제 지 가추추 두추추디 마지스 디순고
Yes. And then it says, do not be sporadic, which basically means, well, we shouldn't engage in practice that today we really practice well, but tomorrow we feel like, oh no, tomorrow I don't feel like practicing. But instead we should be diligent, we should be persevering in that no matter what, every day I will practice, every day I will engage in the practice of mind training. And then train with decisiveness. So not just should we continuously at all times engage in practice, but with decisiveness, with determination. And then it says, be released through the two, investigation and close analysis. So we should analyze our mind. We should really analyze and investigate our mind in terms of what is happening, what is arising in our mind. Are there any afflictive emotions? Is there any self-grasping, self-centeredness, and so forth? And once we've analyzed, we've investigated our mind in that way, well, be released by it, be released through applying the antidote. So first analyze and then apply the antidote. And the next one is, do not boast of your good deeds. In the sense that even if we engage in virtuous actions and actions benefiting others, we should not tell others about it. Oh, I've really made an effort to benefit you here. So boast in such a way. We shouldn't do that. And then it says, do not be ill-tempered, which really kind of means, Rinpoche says, it's kind of a type of envy in that when, well, of course, we shouldn't be ill-tempered when someone harmed us, stresses us out, etc. But also if someone was less successful in the past and is now more successful than you are, instead of being unhappy about it, being envious about it, well, we should be happy about it and not feel that sense of jealousy or competitiveness. And then it says, the next one is also quite nice. He says, it's like, do not be fickle, as in like, oh, when something great happens right away, we're so pleased. And then when something negative or something that we don't like, when that happens, well, then we're totally depressed. We shouldn't be fickle-minded in that way. So immediately be totally excited about it or immediately depressed about it.
타마디 로제 타마디 워치만 되세. 워치 was는 디리다 미신다기 배 뛰어 침부시부들에 당해 줘로. 치퉁부들에 치퉁부세요 말에. 배 치지부들에 당 다나신 체랑배 할레베 야부리세. 체랑배 야슈 나기 야슈르디 치디로 워치스르. 워치 치스르. 딘데기 배 뛰어기 치지부당 치침부당 치 하장기 배 다 태제치 무세요 말이 치 딘데기 배 하장기 야부리세기 배 치 통부기 딘데기 치 베제 땅에 랑라 뛰어 동킨다 힌라 용그리에 상배 제어디 제베 토네 로종기 나린 제당 취나린디 마지스 이 로제 타마들이 디제 다디 오디라 니망가부 도언디 샹주랑도 주로 인세디 로종 된데미 숑디기 취기 치워디 땡겨오래 가레스나 로종 된데미 취디 나린 제벌디네 니망가부 세디디레다 senje니마 뇨모니마 지조 참만나로로 뇨모 슈침부차 뇌차 슈침 마제 슈침 지조 베스 실링군이 하장기 뇨저 가사갈라 뇨저기 강대바 징임바당 잠시바 강대베 지조디 디나 데바 이나야 디나 데지시네 수수기 가르치베디 참마 샹초랑도 파주토에지 징임바 가르치베 이나 지조 나로르베 뇨저 lumba 강네야 디 참마 샹초랑도 파주토에기 제레요레스 디추기 치워드리 다 오늘 디답이 취디 간에 중벌을러나 민가 뒤진 힘부디스 다 민가스러 용디간라 디로 취 나네 제라 지당 상제 중린데기 취 자침부 송요 다디 자치라디간라 니뇽지기 토네 취 서부 나네 제기 더 피드 중어지 인자 민가스고로 다 딘데 민가 뒤주스론 하이 뒤주디베 동야기 나로라 동야슈디로 딘데기베 뒤주 힘부디 라마 셀리바니 주바이스 세상 로준 된데만디 조우제제 라마 셀리바니 줄레반다도 디 취기 주바디 송버리.
And then the last one is do not wish for gratitude. Gratitude here, well, the way Rinpoche explained it, it's actually less gratitude, but this great praise. So like applaud, you like honor for what you've done. So without wishing for others to admire you and laud you, applaud you for what you've done. So she shouldn't do that. Having engaged in mind training, we shouldn't expect others to kind of show, to kind of express that kind of praise. We shouldn't wish for that. So these are the different aspects, the way we should practice. And then it says, through this proliferation of the 5 degenerations, transform every event into the path of enlightenment. Now we talk about this time we're in right now of the 5 degenerations, when sentient beings degenerate, afflictive emotions, they degenerate, and so forth. So in other words, at a time when there are a lot of problems in society, there are a lot of problems, a lot of adverse conditions arise, there are less conducive conditions. So no matter what the problems are, whatever problems we encounter, every one of them we should transform into the path of enlightenment. So this is kind of a summary of how we should act. And then in terms of where these teachings come from, well, it says this essence of the nectar of Pith instructions was passed down from the one from the Golden Isle. So the one from the Golden Isle is Lama Selingpa. So it was through Lama Selingpa that these teachings, well, they were given by Lama Selingpa to Atisha, and then were passed down all the way to us. And therefore, these are the Pith instructions. So Pith instructions means this word Pith instruction, or Menga in Tibetan. It basically means not, I mean, they're general teachings. Of course, there's so many different teachings of the Buddha, but to bring them together as of like these Pith instructions, and they're like nectar. So nectar, like the substance that celestial beings would consume, would enjoy. So likewise, these Pith instructions, this nectar of the Pith instruction was passed down from Lama Selingpa.
동해 땅이 치세네 당진 뒤에 당하시 단이 시험미주 도스디 기시 체가오 코랑기 송인사레다 코랑기 춘디 간데스 투비 츠디 간데스 코랑라 라비 투비 츠디 송교레 다 코랑로 춘디 토네 당진 뒤에 당아 숑디 토차네 디 슈차베지라 다 냥년제네 다이나 신의한 주범에 나는 주범에 나는 지기도 만나는 지기도 세베 지 가르치네 디워지 종송 시지니 어디 송고래.
Yes. And then these last 5 lines, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, yeah, these 5 lines, they're from Geshe Chekawa himself. So he's basically kind of describing himself, his own situation. So because positive karmic seeds left over from my former training were aroused in me, I felt great interest. And so I've defied the tragic tale of suffering, and I've taken instructions to subdue self-grasping. Now, even if death comes, I have no regrets. So he's saying, because of what I've done in the past, I've generated some interest, and now I've engaged in this practice. I engaged in the practice of mind training, and now I feel like whatever's going to happen is fine. Whether I get sick, well, if I get sick, I get sick. If I die, I die, but I'd be all right. I have no regrets.
다 타마디 어디리샤 기시 체가오 쿠란기 취디 간데스 토바당 취디 쿠란로 토네 쿠란라 취디 냐네 제발라디니 쿠란라 지 냥도 가르 총바 쿠란라 핀도 가르 총바 디린도 세상.
Yes. So really this describes, these last lines, they describe how he went about his practice and how this practice has benefited him and what kind of benefit he reaped from personally engaging in this practice.
Thank you. 주지 하나 까마시 줄았지 최배상도 공다.
So Rinpoche went a little bit longer. It was more than an hour. He went over time, but he says sorry for taking that long, but at least he finished the text.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Rinpoche. Sashi Purki Jukche Meta Primary Rappling Zini De Gyampa Sangye Zingdo Mite Owayi Trokun Namdak Zing Lakshu Patrok Jitsunam. May my Venerable Lama's life be firm, his wide divine actions spread in the 10 directions. May the torch of the teachings of Losar always remain, dispelling the darkness of all beings in the 3 realms. Idam Guru Ratna Mandala Kamnyayatayami. Thank you so much, Rinpoche, for taking so much of Rinpoche's precious time, for giving us these very, very precious teachings, which are so needed in this time. They are so clear and practical and straight to the point, straight into the heart. I could feel my heart going like this. Thank you so much, Rinpoche. Please give us more teachings on Lojong and other aspects of the Dharma, and whatever small merit we accumulated by listening to Rinpoche's words and putting them into practice. Please, Rinpoche, have a long and stable life. Please, Rinpoche, return very, very soon to Tushita.
Thank you. Most welcome. Thank you, all of you. Thank you, Gishima, for translator. Thank you very much. Thank you. Bye-bye. See you next time.
Thank you, Rinpoche. See you very, very soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, Rinpoche.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you, Geshe Khalsam Wangmula, for translating. Thank you, Yuri, for translating into Portuguese. And thank you, everybody, for attending this very, very precious teaching. They were quite amazing, and Rinpoche took so much time. I could see how the window outside of Rinpoche's window got darker and darker. So it must be getting, evening in India. So thank you so much. And if you needed the recordings, they're of course pretty much straight available on our YouTube, or you can check the link in the recordings. And thank you so much, Pamela. She's doing all the technical things. She's now our tech person also, not just director, tech person, everything in one person. Thank you so, so much, everybody. And we have another amazing teaching coming up tomorrow. Geshe-la, put your fingers in your ears. Geshe Khalsam Wangmola will teach tomorrow at 4 o'clock Indian time. So please join us. She zoomed out, so she doesn't have to listen. As you know, Geshe-la herself is very amazing. So please join us tomorrow at 4 o'clock Indian time. And we have the great joy of having Geshe-la teaching of her also very practical topic. Okay, thank you so much. Have a good day, good evening, wherever you are. A wonderful weekend. Bye-bye, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.